Production note: does not appear in story content. This is a completely fictional cinematic story created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Nathaniel Vaughn stood in the lobby of the Meridian Hotel with his phone raised like a trophy, streaming live to 40,000 followers, while his girlfriend Sienna draped herself across his arm like an accessory he'd just unwrapped. "Upgraded," he said directly into the camera, grinning the grin of a man who had never once doubted himself. "Life is short. Trade up." Behind him, on the screen above the concierge desk, a photo of Clara, his pregnant wife, taken without her knowledge at a grocery store, flashed briefly before he laughed and swiped it away. The comments exploded. He read a few aloud. He kept smiling. If you've ever watched someone destroy a perfectly good life and call it liberation, stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story has traveled. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday morning in October, slid under the door of the Brooklyn townhouse like something shameful being discarded quietly. Clara Bennett found them on her way to the kitchen, still in the oversized flannel shirt she'd slept in, her feet bare on the cold hardwood floor. She stood there for a long moment, the envelope in her hand, the weight of it surprisingly light for something that was about to dismantle the last 4 years of her life. She didn't cry right away. That surprised her. She'd expected to collapse, to slide down the wall the way women did in movies, but instead she just stood there in the gray morning light, one hand resting on the small but unmistakable curve of her stomach, and thought, so this is really happening. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter, made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink, and sat down at the table where she and Nathaniel had eaten breakfast together for 3 years. The chair across from her was empty. It had been empty for 2 months. She'd been sleeping in the middle of the bed since August, taking up both sides out of stubbornness more than comfort, and telling herself that the expanding silence in the townhouse was something she was learning to live inside rather than something that was slowly pressing the air out of her lungs. She was 29 years old. She was 11 weeks pregnant, and she was alone in a way she hadn't been since she was 19 and brand new to the city, eating ramen on the floor of a studio apartment in Greenpoint because she couldn't yet afford a table. The difference was that at 19 the loneliness had felt like possibility. Now it just felt like wreckage. Nathaniel Vaughn had not been a cruel man in any obvious, dramatic way. That was the thing Clara kept turning over in her mind in those first weeks after he left. He hadn't hit her. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't been the kind of husband who came home drunk and looking for something to break. He'd been attentive, charming, competent, a man who always knew the right restaurant, who remembered her mother's birthday before she did, who had a gift for making the people around him feel lucky to be in his orbit. The cruelty had been quieter than that, and therefore much harder to name. It was in the way he'd started leaving for the gym at 6 in the morning and coming home after she was already in bed, and in the way he'd started responding to her texts with single words, or not at all. It was in the conversation they'd had in September when she'd told him she was pregnant, that conversation she still couldn't think about directly, like looking at the sun, when he'd gone very still and then said, in a voice that was entirely too measured, "I didn't plan for this, Clara." As though the pregnancy were a project proposal he'd already decided to decline. She'd said, "Neither did I, exactly, but I've been unhappy for a while," he'd said, cutting her off with the same calm efficiency he used in boardroom negotiations. "I think you've known that." She hadn't known that. Or maybe she'd suspected it and decided not to press because she was afraid of what pressing would uncover. She still wasn't sure which was worse. 3 weeks after that conversation, she came home to find half the closet empty. He'd taken his suits, his watches, his collection of first edition hardcovers. He'd left everything she'd given him. The framed photo from their trip to Portugal, the anniversary card she'd made by hand, the small ceramic bowl she'd bought at a craft market in Vermont, and left on his nightstand because it was exactly the shade of blue he'd once said was his favorite color. She'd stood in the closet for a long time, looking at the empty hangers swinging slowly in the draft from the open door, and thought about all the small things she'd paid attention to over 4 years. All the tiny translations of love she'd accumulated and offered. The bowl, the card, remembering how he took his coffee, The way she'd always made sure there were fresh flowers in the apartment because he'd once mentioned, casually, that flowers made a place feel alive. She'd paid such close attention to him. She wasn't sure he'd ever paid that kind of attention to her. Sienna Park had 480,000 Instagram followers, a talent for staging photographs, and a particular gift for making other women feel invisible without appearing to try. She was 24, spectacularly beautiful in the way that photographs well, and she'd been seeing Nathaniel for 6 weeks before Clara found out. Not from Nathaniel, but from a colleague who'd spotted them at a rooftop bar in Tribeca and sent Clara a screenshot with the message, "I'm so sorry, I don't know what to say." Nathaniel's announcement came 2 days later, delivered with the same boardroom composure he'd used for everything else. He was moving in with Sienna. He was sorry for the pain this caused. He hoped Clara could be gracious about the transition. That word, gracious, had struck her like something thrown at her head. She'd said, "I'm pregnant, Nathaniel." He'd said, "I know, we'll handle that." And then, after a pause that went on several beats too long, "Sienna knows, she's fine with it." Clara had stared at him for a long moment, this man she'd chosen and loved and built a life with, and felt something shift very quietly inside her. Not break. Shift, like a wall that had been leaning for a long time, finally deciding to come down in a controlled and deliberate way. "Get out of my house," she'd said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. He'd gotten out of her house. Dutch. The first 3 months after the separation were the ugliest period of Clara's adult life, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. She was not graceful in her grief. She wasn't one of those women who emerged from heartbreak sleek and motivated and immediately signing up for yoga retreats. She was a mess. She ate badly. She cried at inconvenient times. At the grocery store. At her desk. Once in a client meeting when a song came over the Bluetooth speaker that she and Nathaniel had danced to at a friend's wedding. She had to excuse herself for 10 minutes and stand in the hallway pressing her palms against her closed eyes until she could breathe normally again. Her work suffered. She was a landscape architect at a mid-sized firm called Hartwell Studio. Good enough at her job that she'd made senior associate at 28, but the focused, meticulous attention her best work required felt like a resource she'd temporarily lost access to. She made small errors. She rescheduled meetings. Her colleague and closest friend, Renata, started covering for her in ways that Clara recognized and hated and couldn't find the energy to refuse. "You don't have to hold it together all the time," Renata told her one afternoon when they were eating takeout on the studio's small terrace, the Manhattan skyline spread out in front of them in the late October cold. "You're growing a human. Your husband just blew up your life. It's okay to not be okay." "I know that intellectually," Clara said. "My body hasn't gotten the memo." Renata, who had been divorced herself at 32 and had come out the other side with a fierceness Clara admired, gave her a long, assessing look. "The body catches up eventually. Give it time." Clara gave it time. She didn't have much choice. What she hadn't anticipated, and what made everything harder in a way she couldn't have prepared for, was Nathaniel's decision to turn his new relationship into a public spectacle. It started with the Instagram posts. Sienna's account, which Clara had quietly unfollowed, but whose posts kept bleeding through to her through mutual acquaintances and the relentless algorithm, became a catalog of their new life together. Rooftop dinners. Weekend trips to the Hamptons. Sienna draped across Nathaniel's lap on a yacht, with her head thrown back mid-laugh, captioned, "Living for this man." Nathaniel in the background of 100 carefully staged photographs, smiling the smile Clara knew so well, the one that reached his eyes when he genuinely wanted someone to feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. She'd thought that smile was just for her once. She'd been wrong about that, among other things. But the Instagram post she could have survived. What she couldn't entirely survive was the interview. A lifestyle magazine, one of those glossy digital publications that covered New York's social scene with breathless enthusiasm and no particular regard for whether any of it was actually interesting, ran a feature on Nathaniel in November. He was pictured with Sienna in their Tribeca apartment, which was large and expensive and decorated in a style that suggested Sienna had been given a budget and a Pinterest board and turned loose. The interviewer, apparently charmed by Nathaniel's particular brand of confident ease, had asked him about the lifestyle shift. The new relationship, the new apartment, the obvious public reinvention. Nathaniel had said, and this was the sentence that Clara's colleagues read and then called her about, one after another, in a cascade of horrified phone calls over the course of a single afternoon. Some people are built for a certain kind of life, and some people aren't. I spent years trying to make something work that wasn't designed to go anywhere. Sienna's the upgrade I needed. I'm not ashamed to say that. The upgrade. Clara had read that sentence sitting at her kitchen table at 7 in the evening with a glass of water and a half-eaten piece of toast in front of her, her laptop open, her reading glasses slightly fogged from the tea she'd been drinking earlier. She'd read it 3 times. Then she'd closed the laptop, placed it very carefully on the counter, walked to her bedroom, lay down on the bed fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. The upgrade. She was 11 and a half weeks pregnant. She'd spent 4 years building a life with him, learning the geography of his moods and his preferences and his fears, showing up in every way she knew how to show up. She had loved him, genuinely, imperfectly, with the whole complicated machinery of herself. And he had looked at an interviewer from a digital lifestyle magazine and called her insufficient. She lay on the bed and let herself feel the full weight of that for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she thought about the baby. Her son. She'd started thinking of him, though she hadn't yet been told the sex. She'd just decided one morning that the person growing inside her was a boy, and the certainty had arrived fully formed and stayed. She thought about him, small and entirely unaware of any of this, suspended in the quiet dark, entirely dependent on her ability to stay upright. That thought did what the grief counselor and the phone calls from friends and the righteous anger of everyone who knew and loved her had not quite been able to do. It steadied her. She got up. She heated the rest of the soup that was on the stove from earlier. She ate it standing over the sink, looking out the window at the Brooklyn street below, the November rain slicking the sidewalk, a few bare trees catching the streetlight. She made a list of things she needed to do the next morning. A doctor's appointment, a meeting at work she couldn't reschedule any further, a call to her attorney about the divorce timeline. She went to bed at 10 and slept for 7 hours, which was more than she'd slept in weeks. She did not think about Nathaniel Vaughn and his upgrade again that night. She thought about her son and what kind of life she was going to build for him and what she needed to do to be ready. The Brooklyn townhouse had been Clara's idea originally. She'd found it, fallen in love with the crown molding and the small walled garden in the back, and convinced Nathaniel to buy it when he'd been leaning toward a sleek high-rise in Midtown that had no soul. She'd spent 2 years making it into something. Plants in every room, a reading corner in the second bedroom that had eventually become her studio, the garden replanted and tended through 2 full-growing seasons until it looked like something that had always been there. She'd built it. He'd lived in it. After he left, she was grateful for that detail. The house had never really been his in any deep way. It was hers. It fit her. She threw herself back into work with a focus that surprised even Renata. Grief, she discovered, could be metabolized into concentration if you aimed it correctly. She picked up a project she'd been slow-rolling for 2 months, a large-scale residential garden renovation for a brownstone in Carroll Gardens, and redesigned the entire scheme from scratch in 2 weeks, delivering something that her client described as the most beautiful work she'd ever commissioned. The firm's principal, a sharp and quietly respected woman named Margot Hartwell, called her in for a meeting in January and offered her a partnership track. "I'm going to have a baby in April," Clara said. "That seems relevant to tell you." Margot had looked at her for a moment. "It's relevant," she'd said. "It's also not disqualifying. Half the best work I've ever seen has been done by women who were either pregnant or had a kid under 2. I don't know what that says about the brain chemistry, but there it is." She'd leaned back in her chair. "Are you interested in the track or not?" "Yes," Clara said. "I'm interested." She met Adrienne Laurent in February, and the meeting was so ordinary that she didn't fully register it as significant until 3 days later. She'd been at a small gallery opening in Dumbo, a show featuring a former colleague's architectural photography, the kind of event she would normally have skipped in her current state, but had agreed to attend partly because Renata had threatened to physically collect her from her couch, and partly because she was trying, in small incremental ways, to rejoin the world she'd partially retreated from. She was 20 weeks pregnant, visibly so now, wearing a dark green wrap dress and the good wool coat she saved for occasions she wanted to feel like herself in. He'd been standing in front of a photograph of an industrial canal, holding a glass of red wine he didn't seem to be drinking. He was maybe 40, lean and dark-haired, wearing a well-cut charcoal suit with no tie, the kind of quiet elegance that didn't announce itself. He had the look of someone who was genuinely looking at the photograph rather than performing the act of looking at it. She'd stopped beside him more or less at random because she'd already done 2 circuits of the gallery and needed somewhere to stand, and they'd started talking about the photograph, the strange beauty of infrastructure, the way industrial structures develop their own unplanned aesthetics over time. And she'd found herself talking for longer than she'd intended, more freely than she'd talked to anyone in months, the conversation ranging out from photography to landscape to the question of what made a place feel inhabited versus merely occupied. He'd introduced himself simply as Adrian. She'd introduced herself as Clara. They'd talked for 45 minutes. When the gallery began to thin out, he'd asked if she wanted to continue the conversation somewhere with better seating, acknowledging the practical reality of her standing for long stretches. She'd said she should get home. He'd said, "Of course," and given her a card, the kind that contained only a name and a number and nothing else, and said it had been genuinely the most interesting conversation he'd had in several months, and that he hoped he'd have the chance to continue it. She'd put the card in her coat pocket and thought about it for 3 days before she texted him. The thing about Adrien Laurent that took Clara some time to understand was the way he listened. She was accustomed, she realized, to being in conversations where the other person was already formulating their next sentence while she was still finishing her thought, where the back and forth had a competitive rhythm to it, each person maneuvering for position. Nathaniel had been like that. Most people she knew professionally were like that. It was so standard she'd stopped noticing it. Adrien listened the way someone listens who is genuinely interested in what the answer will be before it arrives. He asked follow-up questions that were specific to what she'd actually said, not just the general neighborhood of the topic. He remembered things she'd mentioned once and came back to them weeks later. He didn't offer his opinion on her choices unless she asked for it, and when she did, he gave it plainly and without hedging. He was also, she found out gradually, because he volunteered information about himself sparingly and without theatrics, extraordinarily wealthy. He'd started a software infrastructure company in his mid-20s, sold it at 31, and had since operated through a private investment firm that preferred anonymity to press coverage. He owned property in several cities and spent large amounts of his time working on a private foundation that funded urban sustainability projects, which was the connection to landscape architecture that had first given them something to talk about at the gallery. She found out the scale of his wealth, not from him, but from Renata, who had looked him up after their first dinner and called Clara in a state of agitation. "Clara," Renata said, "the man is worth something north of $3 billion. He said he did well," Clara said. "He did well," Renata repeated in a tone that implied this was the understatement of the decade. "How are you so calm about this?" "Because he's also just a person," Clara said, which was true. He was a person who forgot where he'd left his reading glasses and had a strong and somewhat unreasonable opinion about the correct way to make French press coffee, and occasionally got distracted in the middle of a conversation by a thought he'd been chasing and had to apologize and ask her to start over. He was not a symbol or a category or a compensating narrative. He was a person who made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she was fully visible. She wasn't rushing anything. She wasn't using him, to make sense of what Nathaniel had done. She was trying to be careful about that distinction, because she was honest enough with herself to know the temptation existed and honest enough to refuse it. If whatever was developing between them was real, it would develop at the pace of something real. She wasn't going to crowd it or speed it up or let the wreckage of the previous 4 years make decisions on her behalf. But she also couldn't pretend that there wasn't something here, something she hadn't expected. Something that had arrived when she had stopped looking for it and was entirely absorbed in the work of keeping herself together. In March, Nathaniel discovered that Clara was seeing someone. He found out the way he found out most things he wasn't supposed to know, through other people's social media accounts. A friend had photographed a dinner party that both Clara and Adrien had attended, a casual gathering at a mutual acquaintance's apartment in Park Slope, and while neither Clara nor Adrien had posted anything or tagged anyone, someone else had. A single photograph of 12 people around a long table, laughing, mid-conversation, entirely unposed. Clara was in the foreground, her pregnancy visible, her head tilted back in genuine laughter, her hand near but not quite touching Adrian's forearm on the table beside her. Adrian was looking at her with an expression that anyone paying attention could read. Nathaniel was paying attention. He always paid attention when it suited him. He called her the next morning. She almost didn't pick up, and she knew the moment she did that she should have trusted that instinct. "Who is that?" he said without preamble. "Good morning, Nathaniel." "The man in that photo. At Josie's dinner. Who is he?" Clara took the phone away from her ear briefly and looked at it, genuinely surprised that he thought this question was one she was obligated to answer. "He's a friend," she said. "Clara." "Nathaniel," she said, in exactly the same tone. There was a silence. She could hear him working to calibrate his response, working to find the angle that would give him what he wanted without sounding like what he was, which was a man who had publicly described his pregnant wife as something he'd upgraded away from, now calling to ask about her social life. "I just think," he said finally, "that given your situation, you should be careful about—" "I'm going to stop you there," Clara said, quietly and clearly. "My situation, as you call it, is something you created. What I do with my life and my time and my company is not information I owe you. We're in the middle of a divorce. The only things we need to talk about are the things our attorneys are already talking about. Everything else is none of your business." "I just don't want you to get—" "Nathaniel, I'm hanging up now. Take care of yourself." She hung up and stood in her kitchen for a moment, the phone in her hand, aware that her heart was beating harder than she'd have liked. Not from fear, from something older and more stubborn, the residue of 4 years of caring what he thought, the muscle memory of making herself smaller to fit inside his frame of what she should be. The baby moved, a small, definitive nudge from the inside, as though to underline a point. She put the phone face down on the counter and went back to the drawing she'd been working on. Meanwhile, and Clara was only piecing this together from the fragments that reached her through mutual acquaintances, secondhand and imprecise, Nathaniel and Sienna's relationship was not going as well as its carefully curated public presence suggested. The details she got from different sources over different weeks were these. Sienna had been asked to leave a gallery opening after a confrontation with another influencer over a seating arrangement. Sienna had apparently spent $17,000 in a single afternoon at a store in Soho and then disputed the charge when Nathaniel objected to the amount. Sienna had shown up to a dinner Nathaniel was hosting for a potential business partner and proceeded to document the entire evening for her social media presence with a kind of aggressive thoroughness that had made the business partner visibly uncomfortable. Nathaniel had been overheard at a bar telling someone that the relationship was complicated. Clara did not feel satisfaction at any of this. She did not feel nothing either. She was human, and there was a part of her that recognized, grimly, the particular justice of watching someone who had publicly called you an insufficiency discover that the thing they'd traded you for was less substantial than advertised. But she was careful with that feeling. She didn't feed it or indulge it, or let it become something she organized her days around. She had more interesting things to organize her days around. Atamk. Her son was born on April 14th, 6 days past his due date, after a labor that lasted 19 hours and was nothing like the television version of the experience. Clara had Renata in the room with her, which was what she'd wanted. Her mother flew in from Portland 2 days before and spent the first week at the townhouse, which was also what she'd wanted, though she hadn't known how much until her mother arrived with 2 bags of groceries and a matter-of-fact competence that made Clara feel, for the first time since September, like someone was taking care of her. She named him Oliver. He was 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with dark hair, and the kind of expression that suggested he was already reserving judgment on everything he encountered. The moment she held him, actually held him, all of him, with both arms, her face pressed against the top of his head, she felt the landscape of her life reorganize itself entirely and permanently. Not because the pain disappeared, it didn't. Not because everything was suddenly easy. It wasn't. But because the question of what she was building and who she was building it for had been answered so thoroughly that it stopped being a question. He was 3 days old when Adrian came to the hospital, quietly, without ceremony, with a small bunch of pale yellow tulips and the slightly uncertain expression of a man who wasn't sure of the protocol for this exact situation. Clara was exhausted and unpresentable and couldn't find it in herself to be anything other than entirely honest. "He's incredible," Adrian said, looking at Oliver in the bassinet with an expression Clara couldn't quite parse, but felt somehow was genuine. "He's very new," Clara said. "He mostly sleeps and eats and exists." "That sounds like a good life, honestly," she laughed, which she hadn't expected to do. It hurt her stitches. She didn't care. Spring came. Oliver grew. Clara worked from home for 6 weeks and then went back to the studio 3 days a week, Oliver in the care of her mother, who had extended her stay indefinitely with a practicality Clara suspected would turn permanent, and that she was not going to argue with. The partnership track moved forward. She took on the largest commission of her career, a full redesign of the public garden space for a cultural center in Fort Greene, and threw herself into it with a focus that felt, for the first time in years, entirely clean of fear. She wasn't working to prove something to anyone. She was working because she loved the work, because she was genuinely good at it, and because it was one of the things she was building for her son to see. She and Adrian moved carefully, at the pace of something they were both protecting. He had dinner at the townhouse on Wednesday evenings and came to Oliver's 1-month checkup, not because she'd asked him to, but because he'd asked if he could, and she'd said yes without overthinking it. They were not in a rush. They were not performing. They were two adults with complicated histories and demanding professional lives, and it turned out an unusual amount of genuine regard for each other, navigating the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties of the thing with as much honesty as they could manage. By June, she'd stopped thinking about Nathaniel Vaughn for days at a time. That felt like the real measure of progress, not the big dramatic moments, but the quiet disappearances of him from her daily thought. The morning she woke up, and her first thought was Oliver, who would be making sounds in his room by 6. And her second thought was the garden design. And her third thought was what kind of coffee she was going to make, and he simply wasn't anywhere in the sequence. She was still angry, sometimes. She still found the corners of it late at night when Oliver was sleeping and the house was quiet and she was alone with whatever she hadn't gotten around to processing during the day. The interview. The word upgrade. The particular cold efficiency of a man who had looked at what they'd built and decided it wasn't worth finishing. She didn't pretend otherwise, didn't package the anger into something more palatable. It was part of what had happened to her, and she was honest enough to own the whole story. But it was changing shape. Slowly, like something being worn smooth by water. It was becoming something she'd survived rather than something that was still happening to her. The difference mattered. It was in July, on an unremarkable Thursday, that Nathaniel saw something that stopped him entirely. He was on his phone, scrolling through the feed of a society column that covered New York's more aesthetically oriented social events, looking for the kind of coverage that might include himself, a habit he'd developed that he didn't quite want to examine too closely. And there, between a profile of a downtown gallerist and a photo set from a benefit dinner in the West Village, was a brief item about the upcoming Laurent Foundation Gala, the annual event that Adrian Laurent's foundation hosted to raise funds for urban environmental projects. The accompanying photograph was new, a preview image for this year's gala coverage. In it, Adrian Laurent stood at what appeared to be a casual preview event, talking to someone just out of frame. He was smiling. The caption described him as attending with landscape architect and recent Hartwell Studio partner Clara Bennett, who is consulting on the gala's garden installation. There was a photograph of Clara in the caption link, a recent one. She was standing in a garden space, pointing at something, laughing at whatever the photographer had said. She was wearing a pale gray shirt, and her hair was up, and she looked absolutely nothing like a woman who had been destroyed by anything. Nathaniel put his phone down and stared at the wall of the Tribeca apartment. Sienna's decorating choices, he had realized belatedly, all surface and no depth, for a very long time. Adrian Laurent. He knew the name. Everyone in New York's business world knew the name, or knew of it, the way you knew of things that existed in a stratosphere slightly above yours without having direct access to them. He knew the approximate scale of what Adrian Laurent represented, in terms of money and influence, and the particular kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself because it had nothing to prove. He thought about Clara. He thought about the word he'd used in the magazine, the one that had made his colleagues call him to congratulate him on his candor, and had made his mother call him to ask if he was actually doing okay. He thought about how he'd explained it to himself at the time, that he and Clara had wanted different things, had been growing in different directions, that it was better for both of them. These were not things that he believed entirely, but that he had repeated often enough to develop the texture of belief. He sat there for a while, not quite with what he had, not quite without it. Somewhere in the uncomfortable middle of a life he had arranged to look exactly like what he'd wanted, unable to account for the specific feeling of loss that was moving through him like a current, looking for something to attach to. Sienna came in from somewhere, phone in hand, already in the middle of a sentence about something he stopped registering. He said, "Sure," without knowing what he was agreeing to. She kept talking. He looked at the wall. Outside, across the East River, in the Brooklyn townhouse with its walled garden, the roses in their second full bloom, the lavender that Clara had planted in the spring finally establishing itself in the south bed, Oliver asleep upstairs in the room she'd painted the blue of the ceramic bowl she'd once left on Nathaniel's nightstand. Clara was at her drafting table with a cup of tea and the Fort Greene garden drawings spread out in front of her. Her phone lit up with a text from Adrian. "Still on for Saturday?" The farmer's market thing. She looked at it for a moment. Outside, the July light was long and golden on the garden. She could hear, faintly, the sound of Oliver stirring. "Yes," she typed back. "Oliver will need to stop at every single vegetable stall." "Obviously," came the reply. "That's the whole point." She put the phone down and turned back to the drawings. The garden at Fort Greene was going to be extraordinary. She knew that with the clean certainty of someone who had found their footing again after a long time on unsteady ground. It was going to be the best work she'd ever done. She could see the whole thing when she closed her eyes, the line of it, the green architecture, the way light would move through it at different hours of the day. She picked up her pencil and kept working. The farmer's market on Saturday was, as promised, a disaster in the best possible way. Oliver was 4 months old and had recently discovered that the world was full of textures and colors he hadn't previously been consulted on, and he had opinions about all of them. Adrian had arrived at the townhouse at 9 in the morning with a reusable bag and an expression of reasonable confidence that Clara had learned by now to recognize as the specific look of a man who had never accompanied a 4-month-old anywhere and was about to receive an education. They made it 3 stalls before Oliver decided the fabric carrier was insufficient and demanded to be held at a different angle. They made it 2 more before he spotted a display of orange dahlias and became convinced, with the absolute conviction of someone who had very recently acquired opinions, that he needed to be closer to them. Clara stood with him in front of the flowers, tilting him forward so he could look, and watched his expression cycle through concentration and something that might have been wonder. "He likes orange," Adrian said, watching over her shoulder. "He likes anything that's not what he was just looking at," Clara said. "The attention span is a work in progress. He's 4 months old. He has a demanding mother. High expectations come early." Adrian laughed. A real one, which he did less readily than most people, but which, when it came, was entirely unguarded. He bought the dahlias. He also bought tomatoes they didn't need, a jar of honey from a beekeeper, who spent 12 minutes explaining his process to them, while Oliver stared at the man's large beard with an expression of deep philosophical concern, and a bunch of herbs that Clara pointed out she already had growing in the garden. "You said garden," Adrian said, handing her a sprig of rosemary. "Like, that's a reason not to also have it in a jar." "That's exactly what a jar of rosemary is. Redundant rosemary." Everything in my apartment is redundant to something," he said. "I like having things." It was such a plainly human thing to say, slightly self-aware, slightly unapologetic, that she found herself smiling at him for longer than the moment strictly required. He noticed, in the way he noticed things, and didn't make a thing of it. They ate breakfast at a table outside a coffee place on Court Street, Oliver asleep in the stroller in the small, improbable miracle of timing that new parents learn to exploit without hesitation. Clara wrapped her hands around her cup and let the July heat sit on her shoulders. Across the table, Adrian was reading something on his phone that he periodically set down to rejoin the conversation and then picked up again, a habit she'd initially found slightly irritating and had since reclassified as honest, because he was the same way in every context, not performing undivided attention when his attention was actually divided. "The foundation people want me in London in September," he said, not quite looking up. "For how long? 10 days? Maybe 2 weeks?" He put the phone face down. I'm trying to condense it to one trip rather than two. Seems sensible, she said. He looked at her. I'd like you to come, if you wanted to, if it's possible with Oliver. She hadn't expected that. She turned her cup in her hands. That's a significant ask. I know, I'm not pressuring you toward it. I'm telling you it would matter to me if you did. But he said it the same way he said most things, plainly, without engineering the delivery to produce a particular effect. But it's September. You don't have to think about it now. She did think about it, though, on and off for the rest of the day, while Oliver napped and she worked on a section of the Fort Greene drawings that had been resisting her all week. The question of September sat in the back of her mind in the particular way that questions you haven't decided what to do with tend to sit, quietly, waiting. The Fort Greene Commission was the most demanding project of Clara's career, and it was also, she'd slowly come to understand, the most important one. Not in terms of what it would do for her professionally, though it would do a great deal, but in terms of what it asked of her. The cultural center that had hired Hartwell's studio was a serious institution, a performing arts and gallery space that had been a fixture of the neighborhood for 30 years and was undergoing a full renovation that included the complete redesign of its half-acre exterior garden, which served both as community green space and as the entrance experience for visitors. What Clara had proposed, and what the client had approved after 2 rounds of revisions, was a design that moved away from the formal arrangement the space had always had, and towards something that felt grown rather than placed. Native plantings in large organic groupings, a central pathway that widened into a small gathering space, then narrowed again before opening onto the main entrance. Water, several large trees that would take years to reach their intended scale, which meant committing to a future that extended well past the project's completion date. Her colleague Marcus, who'd been assigned to assist on the project, had looked at the tree plan and said, "These won't really look right for another 8 years." "I know," Clara had said. "Some of the clients get nervous about that, the long-term thing. These clients understand that good things take time. That's why they've been in business for 30 years. She'd paused. "And it's good design. You commit to the vision, or you end up with something that looks like a compromise between what you wanted and what you were afraid to ask for." Marcus had looked at her for a moment. "You've gotten more direct since you came back from leave." "I've gotten more tired of hedging," she'd said, which was accurate. The design required her to be on site in Fort Greene 2 mornings a week for the duration of the installation phase, which ran from June through late August. She liked the site visits, liked the smell of turned earth, and the specific pleasure of watching something she'd drawn on paper begin to exist in 3 dimensions, like talking to the landscaping crew, like the small negotiations between what the plan said and what the ground actually wanted to do. There was a lead installer named Darnell, who had been doing this work for 22 years and had the particular combination of respect for the design and opinion about its implementation that Clara had learned to value, the kind of honesty you couldn't buy and couldn't train for. "This section here," he said one morning in July, pointing at a stretch along the west border that Clara had specified for a low meadow planting, "is going to get more afternoon shade than your drawings account for. Building shadows shift in August. I've installed on this block before." She looked at where he was pointing, recalculated in her head. "What would you do with it?" "Ferns and some shade-tolerant stuff. Maybe rethink the grasses." He watched her face to see how she took this. A lot of architects didn't take it well. "Show me," she said. He walked her through it. She took notes. She went back to the studio and adjusted the plan and sent him the revision before end of day. He texted back, "That's better." 2 words. Coming from Darnell, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She filed it away as one of the small good things, the kind of day that didn't announce itself as significant, but that, when you looked back later, turned out to have been exactly what you needed. In the middle of all of this, Nathaniel had started texting. Not often, and not about anything that required a response. That was the particular sophistication of it. The messages were angled too casually to justify ignoring them outright, but contained nothing that actually needed answering. A news article about a landscape architecture award with the note, "Saw this, thought of you." A photograph of the building they'd looked at together in their first year of marriage, now converted into condominiums with the message, "Remember this place?" Once, And this one had made her put the phone in a drawer for an hour before she could respond neutrally. A photograph of a corner of the Brooklyn townhouse garden, visible in the background of a real estate listing for the building next door, captioned, "Simply looks good." He knew she'd replanted the garden. He was telling her he'd been looking. Her attorney, a sharp and impatient woman named Deirdre, advised her to stop responding entirely. "You don't owe him access," Deirdre said. "The divorce is moving. Everything that needs to be communicated goes through me. The rest of this is noise." "I know it's noise," Clara said. "Then why are you still answering?" Clara thought about it. "Muscle memory," she said finally. 4 years of paying attention to what he wanted. "It takes time to unlearn." "Unlearn faster," Deirdre said, which was not compassionate but was useful. She stopped answering the texts. The silence that followed was, predictably, followed by a phone call, which she let go to voicemail. The voicemail said, in Nathaniel's most careful and measured voice, that he was thinking about some things, and that he thought they should talk, not about the divorce, but about, and here the message went slightly vague, other things. He said he hoped she was well. He said Oliver was, and then he stopped, and there was a pause. And he said, "I hope he's healthy. I hope you're both healthy." She listened to the message twice. Then she deleted it and texted Renata. He called. The response came back in 30 seconds. "What did you do?" "Deleted it." "Good. Come over for dinner Sunday. Bring Oliver. I'm making the pasta." She went. She brought Oliver. Renata's apartment was loud and warm and full of the smell of tomatoes and garlic, and Renata's husband David held Oliver for 2 hours, while the women ate and talked, and Clara allowed herself the specific relief of being in a room where everyone understood her without her having to explain herself. It was the kind of evening that replenished something she'd been running low on without quite knowing it. She drove home at 10 with Oliver asleep in the car seat, the city lights washing across the windows, and thought, "I am not the same person I was in October." It wasn't a triumphant thought. It was just an observation, made with something close to gratitude. Nathaniel's life, meanwhile, was not improving in the ways he'd been counting on. The business venture he'd been developing for the past year, a tech-adjacent startup that was, in the way of many tech-adjacent startups, somewhat difficult to explain clearly, had run into a series of problems that were partly the market, and partly, according to people who'd worked with him, partly Nathaniel. He was a good operator, but an impatient one, the kind of founder who had a compelling vision and the charisma to attract early believers, but who got restless when the grinding middle phase required more sustained discipline than the exciting early phase. 2 senior hires had left within 6 months. A funding round that had looked solid in April had softened by June for reasons his lead investor described with diplomatic vagueness as alignment questions. And Sienna, who had moved into the Tribeca apartment in November with the understanding that this was the beginning of something spectacular, was becoming increasingly difficult to live with in the specific way of someone who has been promised a narrative. The beautiful upgrade, the new beginning, the life that looked the way life should look from the outside. And is realizing, slowly, and then all at once, that the narrative doesn't match the experience. She wanted things. This was not a character flaw. It was a plain fact. But the things she wanted kept expanding to absorb whatever space was available for them. She wanted events to attend and to be seen at. She wanted Nathaniel to care about how they appeared together on her social media and to cooperate with the staging that the appearance required. She wanted to be introduced to the serious people in his life, the business contacts, the old friends, the people whose names meant something. And then she wanted those people to be as impressed by her as she'd expected. They frequently were not, and she took this as a reflection of Nathaniel's failure to properly represent her. "You didn't tell Tyler what I do," she said, the night after a dinner with a college friend of Nathaniel's that had not gone the way she'd hoped. "I told him you were an influencer," Nathaniel said, which he said with less careful neutrality than he'd intended. "You said it like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like you were embarrassed." He didn't answer right away, which was, she correctly read, its own answer. The argument that followed lasted 2 hours and covered, among other things, the dinner, the way Nathaniel said her profession, the degree to which his friends were dismissive of creative work, the degree to which Nathaniel defended them in the moment, the degree to which he did not defend her in any number of other moments she had been cataloging, and a brief but pointed detour through the question of whether Nathaniel had ever actually been proud of her or whether she had been, in some sense, decorative rather than valued. That last question landed somewhere neither of them was prepared for. Nathaniel went to bed without resolving it. He lay in the dark and thought about the word decorative, which was an interesting word to have thrown at him because the thing it rhymed with in his current mental state was another word, upgrade, that he'd been trying not to examine too closely for the past several weeks. He had done more research on Adrienne Laurent than he would have admitted to anyone. It had started as a straightforward information-gathering exercise, knowing what you were dealing with was a reasonable thing, and had evolved, over several evenings, into something he was less able to characterize charitably. He knew the broad outlines of Adrienne's professional history. He knew about the Foundation. He knew that the Foundation's annual gala was the following March, and was considered one of the city's more genuinely significant charitable events, attended not by the merely rich, but by the specifically influential. He knew that Clara was involved in designing the garden installation for the event. He had looked up photographs of Adrienne Laurent. There weren't many. The man clearly managed his public presence with unusual deliberateness, but there were enough. He was not what Nathaniel had expected, and he was honest enough, in his private moments, to acknowledge that he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Someone more obviously performative. Someone whose wealth announced itself the way his own had started to, through the visible consumption of the right things in the right places. Adrienne Laurent looked, in every photograph Nathaniel could find, like a man who had nothing to prove. It was a quality Nathaniel recognized and did not currently possess. He was not a stupid man. He could follow the logic of his own situation if he forced himself to. He'd left Clara, had engineered the leaving carefully, had told himself the story of his own unhappiness with enough repetition that it had acquired the feel of truth, and had replaced her with something that looked like what he'd wanted and turned out not to be. And now Clara had, without any evident effort to do so, become exactly the thing he hadn't known he was walking away from until he was already gone. He didn't articulate this clearly, even to himself. It came to him in fragments, the memory of her in the doorway of the Carroll Gardens project she'd finished in the winter, photographed in an architecture magazine, her hair loose, laughing at something the photographer had said, looking entirely like herself. The sound of her voice on the phone when she'd told him his call wasn't her business. Not cold, not performatively confident, just clear. The fact that she'd named their son Oliver, which was somehow the detail that got to him most, because it was exactly the name he would have expected her to choose. She knew herself that well. She always had. He'd failed to pay attention to that. He'd been paying attention to everything he thought he wanted, which turned out to be a much smaller and less interesting list than he'd believed. August arrived heavy and hot, the kind of New York summer that made the city feel slightly deranged. Clara had Oliver in a paddling pool in the garden on weekday mornings before the heat got serious, watching him discover water with the same comprehensive intensity he brought to everything. He was 5 months old and had recently mastered rolling and was working on sitting up, a project he approached with genuine frustration when his arms didn't cooperate and genuine triumph when they did. She'd started talking to him while she worked, narrating, explaining, asking questions he couldn't yet answer. A habit Renata had said was slightly deranged and her mother had said was exactly right. "The lavender's doing well," she told him one morning, him on his back on a blanket in the shade, while she crouched in the south bed with her hands in the dirt. It took all season to establish. Things that take a long time to establish are usually the most worth having. Oliver made a sound of either agreement or digestive notification. She took it as agreement. Adrienne came by on Thursday evenings, and they'd evolved, over the summer, a comfortable shape to the time. Cooking dinner, talking about their respective weeks, Oliver cycling through his current evening moods of either entertaining alertness or emphatic fury about the general situation of being 5 months old. There was a Wednesday night in August when Oliver had been up screaming from 11 to 1 with what turned out to be gas, and Claire had been so exhausted by the following Thursday that she'd fallen asleep on the couch 40 minutes after dinner while Adrienne was in the middle of telling her something about a foundation board meeting. She'd woken up an hour later to find a blanket over her, Oliver asleep in his bassinet, and Adrian at the kitchen table with her copy of a book she'd left there, reading, a cup of tea in front of him. "You fell asleep," he said, unnecessarily. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice still thick. "Don't apologize. You needed it." She sat up and pushed her hair off her face. Through the window, the Brooklyn street was quiet. The kitchen light made everything warm. "I don't usually do that." "You're running on 4.5 hours of sleep on a good night. You're allowed to fall asleep on your own couch." "It's not very—" she started. "Clara," he said, and something in the plainness of it made her stop. "I'm not here because everything needs to be performed correctly. I'm here because I want to be here." He said it without particular emphasis, the same way he said everything that was actually true. "You being asleep on the couch doesn't change that." She looked at him for a moment. This man in her kitchen, reading her book, entirely at ease in a space that she'd thought of for a long time as hers alone. And he was at ease in it. Not because he was claiming it, but because he'd been invited in gradually and hadn't overstepped and had waited for the invitation rather than assumed it. "Thank you," she said. It came out smaller and more real than she'd intended. "Don't thank me for having a cup of tea at your table. I'm thanking you for all of it." He set the book down. "You do the same," he said simply. "You have done the same." She had. In small ways, over months, the accumulated attention that he'd recognized and responded to with the kind of person he was being. It was, she thought, not so different from what she'd done for years with Nathaniel, except that this time the attention was being reflected back at her, instead of disappearing into a place that never quite filled up. The partnership at Hartwell Studio was made official in September, in a short ceremony that was really just drinks in the conference room with her colleagues and a handshake from Margot that meant more than most things she'd been handed in her career. Her name would appear on the studio's letterhead. Her projects would carry the full weight of her vision. She was 29 years old, 5 months past a divorce she hadn't wanted, in possession of a son who was learning to sit, and a garden that was hitting its stride, and a career that was finally the shape she'd always known it could be. Renata toasted her with sparkling water. She was training for a half marathon and avoiding alcohol on principle until October, and said, "I want to note for the record that you did all of this while Nathaniel was busy calling you an upgrade problem." "He didn't call me an upgrade problem," Claire said. "He implied it. Same thing. Can we not make this about Nathaniel?" "I'm making it about you," Renata said. "The Nathaniel mention is just for context, to underscore the scale of his error." She raised her glass. "To Clara, partner, mother, person who was always going to be fine and knew it even when she couldn't quite feel it." Clara raised her glass. "That's a very long toast. I've been workshopping it for months." She laughed and drank and let herself feel, without qualification, good. She went to London. The decision had been made gradually, and then in the way decisions sometimes resolve themselves, all at once. She'd been on the phone with her mother on a Sunday afternoon, half watching Oliver attempt to eat a teething ring with more ambition than technique, when she'd said, thinking out loud, "Adrian wants us to come to London in September," and her mother had said, "Us?" with a specificity that landed. "Oliver and me," Claire had said. And then because her mother was one of the few people she could be entirely honest with, "It's significant. The asking. Is that why you haven't decided yet?" "Partly." "Clara," her mother said, in the same voice she'd used when Clara was 17 and overthinking a choice that actually had a clear answer. "Are you happy when you're with him?" She thought about Thursday evenings, the farmer's market, the kitchen in August. "Yes," she said. "Does he make things harder or easier?" "Easier. Except when I don't want them to be easier." "And why don't you want them to be easier?" She didn't have an immediate answer for that. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. What she came to, slowly and without any particular drama, was this. She'd been afraid that easier meant that she was letting herself be rescued, and she'd wanted to prove, to herself more than anyone, that she didn't need rescuing, that she was building this life on her own terms, under her own power, with her own hands. And she had built it. That was true. The partnership, the house, Oliver, the Fort Greene garden that was already in its early form, visibly becoming something extraordinary. None of that disappeared because she chose to also be with someone who made her happy. Those things existed because of who she was, not because of who she was without. She booked the tickets the following Tuesday. Oliver got a passport photograph taken at a drugstore in Park Slope. He looked in it exactly like a person who had deep reservations about the process but was choosing to cooperate temporarily. So, London was gray and cool and full of afternoon light that came in sideways and illuminated things unexpectedly. The face of a building, a row of windows, a part Clara hadn't known was there until they turned a corner and it appeared. She spent the mornings with Oliver while Adrian was in his foundation meetings. Afternoons they explored together, usually on foot because she was constitutionally averse to being inside a car when walking was an option. Oliver in the carrier and then in the stroller when he'd had enough of the carrier and then back in the carrier when he'd had enough of the stroller. She liked Adrian in London, which told her something because travel has a way of revealing the parts of a person's character that regular life can still conceal. He was at ease in cities. He was a good navigator and a bad tourist. He had no interest in things that existed to be looked at, and considerable interest in things that existed to be used, markets, parks, buildings that were still genuinely functional rather than merely preserved. He took her to a canal-side garden in East London that she spent 2 hours in, photographing and taking notes, while he sat on a bench reading and was entirely unbothered by her absorption. "You go somewhere," he said on their walk back. "What do you mean?" "When you're in a place that interests you professionally, you go somewhere else. You're present, but you're also processing." She considered this. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said. "I do the same thing. I just do it with different material." Oliver, from the carrier, expressed an opinion about the pace at which they were walking. Clara adjusted. Adrian reached out and held Oliver's hand briefly, the tiny fingers curling reflexively around his thumb, and didn't comment on it or make it a moment. He just held his hand and kept walking. She filed that away with all the other things. On the 6th night, in the flat, he kept near Marylebone. Books everywhere. A slightly impractical kitchen he'd had designed for cooking seriously and used accordingly. After Oliver was asleep and dinner was eaten and the kind of quiet had settled that exists when two people are entirely comfortable in each other's company, she said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. "I've been careful," she said, "but because I needed to be careful. After everything last year, I had to know what I was doing was real and not just a reaction." She paused. "I know now." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was actually listening rather than preparing his response. "What do you know?" "That this is real," she said. "That I'm here because I want to be here and not because I needed somewhere to land." She held his eyes. "I thought you should know that." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I've known for a while," he said quietly. "I was waiting for you to know it too." She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, London moved around them, indifferent and constant. Oliver slept in the other room. The kitchen was warm. Back in New York, in October, the Fort Greene garden was nearing its first complete phase. The bones of the thing visible now. The pathways in. The large canopy trees planted and staked in the positions she'd put them on paper a year ago. Darnell walked her through the section he'd been most worried about, the west border with its reconsidered planting, and she saw immediately that he'd been right and that the adjustment was better. "Told you," he said. "You told me," she agreed. 8 years, he said, meaning the trees. "They'll look like they've always been there." "That's the goal," she said. "Things that look like they've always been there." He squinted at her. "You know what I mean is it's going to be a long time before you see the final version." "I know," she said. "I'm good with that." She walked the rest of the site alone after Darnell went to handle something at the far end. She stood at the center of what would be the gathering space, the widening in the path, the place where people would stop, and looked at the trees that wouldn't be themselves for years, and the plantings that were just beginning to settle into their positions, and the shape of a place that she'd drawn from nothing and that was now undeniably real. Her phone buzzed, a text from Renata. "Have you seen the gala announcement?" She hadn't. She pulled it up. The Laurent Foundation Gala, March of next year, the event's official press release. Her name appeared in it. Not as Adrian's companion, not in any personal capacity, but as the lead designer of the gala's garden installation, a project that had apparently been quietly generating interest in design circles that she hadn't fully tracked. There were already 2 press inquiries in her studio inbox by the time she opened her email. She stood in the middle of the unfinished garden, phone in hand, reading the release twice. Then she took a photograph of where she was standing, the trees, the path, the late October light at a low angle across the ground, and sent it to Adrian with no caption. His reply came back a minute later. It's going to be extraordinary. She pocketed her phone and stood there a moment longer in the cool air, with the smell of earth around her and the sound of the street at the garden's edge, and the trees that wouldn't be themselves for 8 more years, but were already, even now, exactly where they were supposed to be. She walked back to the studio. She had work to do. The press inquiries about the gala installation turned out to be from 2 different architecture and design publications, and when Clara finally returned both calls in early November, she learned that the Laurent Foundation's decision to commission a designer rather than use a production company had already generated quiet conversation in circles she hadn't known were paying attention to her work. The first call was with an editor at a design journal who wanted a brief interview about the project's concept. Clara agreed, spent 20 minutes on the phone explaining the installation's approach. A temporary garden that used only species native to the Northeast, designed to evoke the idea of a landscape reclaiming a built space, and hung up thinking it had gone reasonably well. The second call was from an architecture writer at a broader interest magazine who, in the middle of asking about the installation, said, "Can I ask you about the Fort Greene project? The photos from the preliminary phase have been circulating in some interesting places." "What places?" Clara asked. "A few landscape architecture forums. Someone posted them. The response has been, there's real interest there." She hadn't known about the photos. Darnell, as it turned out, had taken a series of them on his phone during the installation process, not for publication, just for his own records, and had posted a few to a professional forum he'd been part of for years. The response had exceeded what either of them expected. 3 messages from other landscape professionals asking about the design methodology. One from a city planning official in another municipality who wanted to discuss the approach. One, which arrived in her studio inbox rather than via the forum, from an organization she hadn't heard of called the Urban Greening Network, inviting her to speak at a conference in the spring. She showed the email to Margot, who read it twice, set it down, and said, "I'd accept that." "It's in Denver." "I know where Denver is, Clara." She accepted the invitation. She told herself it was manageable. Oliver would be nearly a year old by spring. She had her mother. She had the studio's support. She could figure out the logistics. The figuring out of logistics had become, over the past year, one of her more reliable competencies. She'd discovered that single motherhood was less a condition defined by what you lacked, and more one defined by what you developed. A particular efficiency, a tolerance for imperfection, a capacity to triage that she hadn't known she had, and that was now completely load-bearing. What she didn't do was tell Nathaniel about any of it. She had, by November, stopped thinking about what Nathaniel knew or didn't know about her life as any kind of relevant data point. He existed in a separate section of her history. Not erased, because erasing was a kind of lie she wasn't interested in, but filed. Finished. She'd been married to him. It had mattered. It had ended. She had rebuilt. These were facts in a sequence, not a wound she kept returning to. The divorce was finalized in the second week of November, on a gray Thursday morning when she sat in Deirdre's office for 45 minutes while papers were reviewed and signed and the legal machinery that disassembles a marriage completed its process. Deirdre, whose affect was not warm but whose competence Clara had come to trust entirely, said, "Done," and slid the final documents across the desk with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had watched people sit in that chair in various states of relief and devastation and had learned to let the moment be what it was going to be. Clara sat with it for a second. Done. The word had a specific weight, not heavy exactly, but substantial, the way a door feels when it finally closes properly. "How do you feel?" Deirdre asked. It was, for her, an unusually personal question. "Finished," Clara said. "In a good way." She went back to the studio and worked for 3 hours on the gala installation drawings, which were at the stage where the overall concept was locked and the specifics were being worked out in detail. plant specifications, lighting considerations, the exact positioning of the temporary pathway structures that would channel guests through the garden space before the main entrance. She'd been wrestling with one particular section near the installation's center, a focal point that she'd initially designed around a water feature she'd since decided was wrong for the space. Too static. The installation needed something alive. She stayed late, ordered food she ate at her desk, and by 9 o'clock had redrawn the center section 3 times. The fourth version used a collection of tall ornamental grasses in varieties that moved at different rates in the same wind, a choreography of motion that you couldn't control or predict, just design the conditions for. She stared at it for a long time. Then she photographed it and sent it to Adrian with the message, "Fix the center." He was in a meeting, apparently, because the response took 20 minutes, but when it came, it was, "The grasses." Yes, that's it. She trusted his eye for these things because she'd tested it repeatedly over the past months, and it had proven reliable. He wasn't a designer. He was quick to say so, and she was quick to agree, but he had the quality that the best clients had, and that was rarer than talent. He could distinguish between the thing that was correct and the thing that merely looked impressive. She'd worked with enough people who couldn't make that distinction to know what it was worth. November deepened into December with the specific energy that New York City develops in the approach to the holidays. The compressed urgency of everyone trying to finish everything before a deadline that is not, technically, any kind of actual deadline, but that the city behaves as though it is. Clara had 3 projects in various stages: the gala installation, a residential rooftop commission she'd taken in October for a building in Cobble Hill, and the continuing maturation of the Fort Greene Garden, which required site visits every 2 weeks through the winter to monitor the new plantings. She managed all 3 with a competence that cost her more than she showed, and that she didn't fully account for until she got a cold in the second week of December and took 4 days to get over it, which was 3 days longer than she'd expected. "You're running yourself at 110%, her mother said on the phone one evening. "You know that. It's December. Everything is at 110% in December." "It was July in July," her mother said. "Clara." "I'm fine, Mom." "You keep saying that." "Because I keep being fine." Her mother was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she disagreed but had decided not to press. Then, "How's Adrian?" "He's good. He's been in Chicago for most of the week." "And when he's not in Chicago?" Clara sat down on the edge of the couch, Oliver in her lap working on a teething ring with serious intent. "He's here," she said. "He's present." She paused. "We're spending Christmas together." A beat. "All 3 of you?" "His family has a place in Vermont. He asked if we wanted to come." She could feel her mother parsing this, assigning it the weight it deserved. "I know," she said, before her mother could say it. "I know what that means." "I'm not saying anything." "You're thinking it very loudly." "Huh? I'm thinking that a year ago you were sitting on the floor of that kitchen eating half a piece of toast and trying to figure out how you were going to get through the next week," her mother said quietly. "And now you're going to Vermont for Christmas with a man who—" She stopped, started again. "I just want you to know that I see how hard you've worked. All of it. The job, the baby, all of it. You didn't wait for someone to fix things. You fixed things." Clara sat with that. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me, just sleep more." She hung up and looked at Oliver, who had given up on the teething ring and was now investigating the texture of her sweater with focused scientific interest. "Your grandmother," she told him, "has a gift for combining compliments with instructions." Oliver looked up at her. He was 7 months old and had recently mastered an expression of polite but firm disagreement that he deployed with impressive consistency. "You have the same face," she said. "I want you to know that." Vermont, at Christmas, was snow and cold, and the specific kind of quiet that city people sometimes forget is possible. Adrian's family's property was a house outside a small town in the Northeast Kingdom, and when Clara arrived with Oliver in the car seat and more luggage than she'd intended, she had discovered that traveling with an infant required provisioning on a scale she would previously have applied to international expeditions. Her first impression was of a place that had been lived in genuinely and for a long time. Books on every surface, rugs worn to a comfortable softness, A wood stove that was the center of the main room in a way that the room's architecture made clear had always been intentional. Adrian's sister, Marguerite, was there with her husband and their two children, aged 4 and 7. His mother, Diane, was in the kitchen when they arrived and came out drying her hands on a dish towel, looked at Clara once, looked at Oliver twice, and said, "Oh, he's wonderful," in a tone that meant she was not performing the sentiment. Clara had prepared herself, in the drive up from the city, for a version of this that was more loaded. The examination of a woman who had arrived in her son's life trailing the wreckage of a previous marriage, pregnant when they met, a whole history of complication that a family would have every right to look at carefully. She'd prepared herself to be patient with scrutiny that might be slightly uncomfortable and was, by most measures, fair. What she got instead was Diane handing Oliver to her husband Gordon so that she could show Clara the kitchen while it was still organized, which it wouldn't be for long because Marguerite's 4-year-old had an approach to organized spaces that was comprehensively destructive. Gordon, a quiet man who had the same quality of unhurried attention as his son, held Oliver against his chest with the practiced ease of someone who had done this with grandchildren. And Oliver, demonstrating the social acuity he had been developing lately, looked up at the older man with an expression of provisional trust. Later, while Marguerite's children were in bed, and the adults were around the wood stove with wine and the remains of a dinner that had been excellent and slightly chaotic, Diane said, without particular ceremony, "Adrian talks about your work." "The landscape architecture?" Clara said. "The Fort Greene project, the gala installation. He explains it very specifically." She paused. "He's not usually specific about other people's work. He's specific about his own, but—" She smiled, a small one. "He pays attention to what matters to you." Clara felt the statement settle. She glanced at Adrian, who was listening with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who knows they're being discussed and has decided to allow it. "He does," Clara said. Marguerite, who was less circumspect than her mother, said, "He spent 20 minutes telling me about the grass installation thing, the ones that move at different rates. I'm an accountant. I don't know anything about grasses." "It's a good detail," Clara said. "He thought so," Marguerite said, looking at her brother with an expression that was half affectionate and half something else. "He's been different this year. Better different." Adrian said, "Marguerite, I'm not saying anything embarrassing. You're incapable of not saying something embarrassing. I'm saying that the grasses thing was beautiful, and it means something that you paid attention to it." She looked at Clara. "It's a compliment. Accept it." Clara looked at Adrian. He looked back at her. The wood stove made a small sound. "I accept it," she said. January arrived, and with it the part of the gala installation project that Clara had known would be the most difficult, the execution plan. The event was in early March, which meant the installation timeline was compressed in a way that required everything to go right more or less simultaneously. She was managing plant sourcing, structural permits for the temporary pathway elements, a lighting subcontractor she'd hired based on a recommendation from Darnell, and a site visit schedule that ran every 10 days. She was doing most of this while managing the Cobble Hill rooftop remotely and attending Oliver's 6-month pediatric checkup and finding time to prepare for the Denver conference in April. She had a whiteboard in her studio office by February that contained, by Renata's count, 47 distinct items in various stages of completion. Renata photographed it and sent the image to Clara with the message, "This is why I will never be a partner." "It's not that bad," Clara replied. "There are subcategories," Renata wrote back. "You made subcategories of your subcategories." The whiteboard was, Clara would admit, a symptom. She was in the phase of the project where the vision was so clear to her that the distance between what existed and what she could see felt unbearably large, and the only way she knew to close that distance was to make the plan extremely explicit and then execute it so precisely that there was no room for the chaos that would otherwise fill in the gaps. She'd always worked this way. It was not a healthy relationship with uncertainty. She knew that about herself. What kept it from tipping into something worse was Oliver, specifically Oliver's refusal to organize his needs around her schedule. He woke up at 5:30 most mornings with the sunny, indiscriminate energy of someone who had slept 10 hours and had no concept of context. He needed feeding and changing and interaction, and by 7, usually a walk that required her to put on actual clothes and leave the house. The walks were, she'd come to recognize, the most functional thing in her daily structure. Half an hour of moving through the Brooklyn streets with Oliver in the stroller, the February cold on her face, away from the whiteboard and the inbox and the 47 items, just present in a body that needed air. She thought about things on those walks that she didn't think about otherwise. She thought about what she was building, not professionally, though that was part of it, but in the larger sense. What she wanted Oliver's life to look like. What she wanted her own life to look like. Whether those two things were as different as she sometimes feared or as compatible as she sometimes hoped. She thought about Adrian and about the particular quality of what they'd built over the past year, and about the fact that she had never once felt like she was navigating it wrong, which was not something she'd ever been able to say about her marriage, not even at its best. She thought about Nathaniel occasionally, less and less, not with bitterness, which had mostly converted itself into something quieter and less combustible, but with the particular clarity that distance gives you. She could see now things she hadn't been able to see when she was inside them. She could see that she had made herself smaller to fit the space he offered her. She could see that she'd confused his attention, when he gave it, with being seen, and that those were not the same thing. She could see that she had known, on some level, for longer than she'd wanted to know, and that she'd kept not knowing because the alternative was a conversation she wasn't ready for. She didn't blame herself for that entirely. She'd been 25 when they married, genuinely in love with someone who was genuinely in love with a version of her. A version that was less ambitious and less particular and less likely to eventually outgrow what he was offering. The version that had shown up instead, steadily and without asking permission, was the one walking through Brooklyn at 7 in the morning in February, managing a 47-item whiteboard, raising a son by herself, designing a garden that would be photographed in 4 weeks by every design publication that mattered. She thought Nathaniel had probably seen that version coming, had seen it and decided it wasn't what he'd signed up for and had executed accordingly. She still thought the execution had been cruel, but the decision itself, to leave rather than stay and resent, she had come around slowly and without anyone watching her do it, to understanding, if not forgiving. Nathaniel, in February, was having a different kind of month. The startup had officially lost its largest investor in the last week of January, in a meeting that Nathaniel described to no one as having gone well because it had not gone well. The investor, a firm he'd spent 8 months cultivating, had been polite about it, which was somehow worse than if they'd been direct. Not the right fit at this stage. The translator's guide to that phrase, which everyone in the room knew, the leadership hasn't convinced us they can get this across the finish line. He'd driven home from that meeting through midtown traffic with the specific dull weight of someone who has been told the truth in a language they can't officially acknowledge. He'd sat in the Tribeca apartment, which still looked the way Sienna had decorated it, all surfaces and images and nothing that accumulated meaning, and poured himself a drink he didn't finish. Sienna was out at something. She was frequently out at something. This had once seemed like evidence of a life so full it couldn't be contained in an apartment, and now seemed like evidence that the apartment was somewhere she was when she had nowhere better to be. He wasn't sure when the reframing had happened. Somewhere around October, he thought, when they'd had the third argument in 6 weeks about something that was, on its surface, trivial, but underneath was the same argument every time. That she wanted him to show up for her life the way she showed up for his, and he wasn't sure he could, and wasn't sure he wanted to. He'd said this to a friend very carefully over drinks in January, not admitting it fully, packaging it in the hypothetical language men use when they want to discuss something real without appearing to discuss something real. His friend had said, "Sounds like it's not working." "It's complicated," Nathaniel said. "It always is," his friend said, which was not helpful but was true. He'd started going back through things in his head, which was a sign he recognized as bad, because going back through things was what he did when the present was uncomfortable. The sequence of the last 18 months. The decisions he'd made and the logic he'd used to make them, and the degree to which that logic was holding up under examination. It was not holding up especially well. He had told himself a story. Most people did, but he'd told his with unusual commitment. The story was about a man who'd made a courageous choice, who'd recognized that what he had was insufficient and reached for something better. He'd told the story publicly, to a magazine, in language he'd felt, at the time, was honest and earned. The upgrade I needed. He'd believed that. He'd stood behind it. What he was discovering in February in the Tribeca apartment with the empty glass and the deal that hadn't closed and Sienna out at something was that the story had required the suppression of a very large amount of information. It had required not looking directly at what he was leaving or what he was choosing, just maintaining forward momentum and not looking back. The momentum had slowed. The not looking back was becoming increasingly difficult. He picked up his phone. He had Clara's number still, had never deleted it, and he looked at it for a long moment. He thought about calling. He thought about what he would say if she answered. He couldn't construct a sentence that was honest and also said what he wanted to say, which was something in the neighborhood of, "I made a mistake. I had something real, and I left it because it didn't look the way I thought it should, and I have been paying for that decision in ways I didn't anticipate." He couldn't say that. He didn't have the language for it, or he had the language but not the right to use it. He put the phone face down on the table. He thought about the word upgrade and about the particular arrogance of believing that a person could be assessed in comparative terms, that the woman who had stayed up with him when he was sick and remembered how he took his coffee and planted a garden in a house he'd been lukewarm about and loved him with the full complicated machinery of herself, that she could be weighed against something newer and found insufficient. He thought about all the attention she'd paid him, the bowl, the card, the flowers. He had not paid that kind of attention to her. He'd received it as a matter of course, the way you receive things you've been given so consistently you stop seeing them. He was seeing them now. The door opened. Sienna came in from her event, phone out, already narrating her evening for her stories. She stopped briefly when she saw him. "You're home," she said, as though this were unexpected. "I live here," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Whatever expression he was wearing, she read something in it that made her set her phone down with the screen facing up. "What's wrong?" He thought about how to answer that. He thought about how honest he was capable of being, in this moment, in this apartment, with this woman who had been, in her own way, exactly what she'd always appeared to be, and who had never deserved to be the solution to a problem she didn't create. "I think," he said slowly, "that I need to be honest with you about something." She sat down in the chair across from him. He noticed that she looked in the direct light, tired in a way that her photographs never showed, tired and young, which was its own complicated thing. "Okay," she said. "But." The gala installation was delivered on March 3rd, a Tuesday, and Clara was on site from 6 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon watching every component go in. The event itself was on Saturday, which gave 2 days of buffer for anything that needed adjusting, which was the appropriate amount of buffer because something always needed adjusting, and it was almost never the thing you'd expected. What needed adjusting turned out to be the lighting on the grasses. The placement she'd specified created a shadow pattern on the pathway that read, in the actual event space, as slightly menacing rather than dramatic. She moved 3 fixtures 45 minutes, reprogrammed the timing sequence, stood back and looked at it. "Better," she said. The lighting subcontractor, a compact woman named Sol, who had the manner of someone who had spent 20 years being right and had stopped needing to perform it, said, "Yeah, that's the one." Clara photographed it. She photographed the whole installation, methodically, from every angle she'd planned and several she hadn't, documenting the things she'd made before the event turned it into something different, before people moved through it and changed the scale of it, and it became, as all installations do, partly theirs and partly hers, and partly something that belonged to the particular night. She sent the photographs to Margot, who replied within minutes. "Clara, this is extraordinary work." She forwarded the same photographs to Darnell because he deserved to see them, because his adjustment to the west border at Fort Greene had taught her something that had informed this. He replied, "Look at that. Told you the grasses were right." She laughed alone in the empty installation, in the late afternoon light, in a space she had drawn from nothing and built into something real. Saturday arrived the way important days tend to arrive, slightly too fast, preceded by a Friday night that Clara couldn't fully sleep through, despite the bone-deep exhaustion of the installation week. She lay in the dark at 2 in the morning, listening to Oliver breathe in his room and running through everything she knew was ready and everything that could still go wrong. Sol had confirmed the lighting. The structural elements had been safety-checked twice. The plant sourcing had been flawless. Darnell had done a final walkthrough on Thursday and texted her afterward. "Ready? She was ready. She knew she was ready. Her brain was simply doing the thing it did the night before things that mattered, cataloging potential disasters in the way of someone who had discovered that worry, for her, was not a protective mechanism but a habit, and that the habits you'd developed in the hardest years didn't always dissolve once the hardest years were over. She thought about this. She thought about the person she'd been a year ago, in this same bed, unable to sleep for entirely different reasons. She thought about the distance between those two insomniacs, the one in October watching her husband's empty side of the bed, and this one who had a career that was about to change, a son asleep down the hall, and a man she trusted entirely coming to collect her at 6:30 in the morning. The distance was not as large as she sometimes wanted it to be. She was still herself, still capable of the 2 a.m. catalog of anxieties, still prone to running at 110%, still learning how to let herself be held without interpreting it as insufficiency, still a work in progress. She suspected she would always be a work in progress, and had mostly made peace with that, except on the nights when she hadn't. But the distance was real. She had traveled it, under her own power, with the help of people who loved her day by day in ways that were not dramatic and were not linear and were, in the aggregate, absolute. She fell asleep at 3. She woke at 6 to the sound of Oliver announcing the morning. She got up. She made coffee. She stood in her kitchen with the early light just beginning to come through the windows, listening to her son make his morning sounds, and thought, okay, let's do this. At 6:30, Adrian arrived at the townhouse. He was in a dark suit that fit him the way his clothes always did, without ceremony, as though the suit were just the ordinary thing he happened to be wearing. He looked at her for a moment in the doorway. She was in the midnight blue gown she'd had made specifically for tonight, a structured wrap design that accommodated the changed geography of her body after Oliver and that she'd tried on 4 times before deciding it was exactly right. Her hair was up. She'd spent an hour on it, and it looked like she'd spent 20 minutes, which was the precise effect she'd been going for. "Clara," he said. Not a full sentence, just her name, in the tone of someone saying exactly what they mean. She felt it settle somewhere in her chest. "Don't be too nice," she said. "I'll be useless all evening." "You're never useless," he said. "You're terrifying." "Is that a compliment?" "For me?" "Yes." Her mother appeared behind her with Oliver on her hip, Oliver in his pajamas with a look of deep suspicion at the proceedings. He studied Adrian with the expression that Clara had privately labeled his "I am forming a comprehensive opinion" face. "Go," her mother said. "We'll be here. He'll be fine. Go." Clara kissed Oliver's head. He grabbed a piece of her hair with his fist, which he always did when he was processing something, and then released it with the considered air of someone who has decided to allow an event to proceed. She picked up her bag. She took a breath. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." Outside, the March night was cold and clear. The car was waiting. She could see at the end of the block, the edge of the walled garden. The roses not yet in bloom, but the lavender in the south bed just barely beginning to show green at its base, the first small assertion of another season arriving. She didn't look at the garden as she walked to the car. She knew it was there. She walked forward. The venue for the Laurent Foundation Gala was a converted warehouse space in the meatpacking district that a celebrated architect had transformed, 15 years earlier, into one of the most requested event spaces in the city. Clara had been inside it once before, for a friend's exhibition opening, and had thought then that it was the rare kind of space that didn't try to disappear, that had a presence, a character, something that pushed back against whatever you put into it rather than simply containing it. She'd been designing into that quality for months. The installation began at the building's entrance and drew guests inward through a pathway of native plantings, the grasses she'd chosen, some as tall as chest height, moving in the climate-controlled air in the slow, differentiated rhythm she'd planned, as if something beyond the building's walls were still in conversation with them. The lighting Saul had calibrated came in at low angles, catching the movement of the grasses and scattering it across the pathway in a way that was neither theatrical nor subtle, but exactly between, which was the hardest thing to achieve and the most satisfying when you did. They arrived to find the installation already drawing attention from guests in the approach queue, people slowing, pausing, pulling out phones to photograph it before they'd even crossed the threshold. She heard fragments. Who designed this? And it feels like a real place. And once, from a woman in an extraordinary red dress who paused and touched a blade of grass with her fingertip. It's moving. Clara let herself feel that for exactly 1 moment before she put it aside and walked in. The interior had been transformed with the design continuity she'd specified. Elements from the exterior installation carried through in the lighting and the arrangement of the table centerpieces. A coherence of vision that she'd fought for in 3 separate planning meetings and that had been worth every minute of the argument. Margot was already inside with her partner and crossed to Clara immediately, took both her hands and said, "I don't have adequate words right now." "You don't need words," Clara said. "I can see your face." "My face," Margot said, "is doing everything words would do and more." Adrian moved easily through the room in the way of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and had made peace with it, stopping to talk with the people who needed his attention and moving on with the precision of a man whose time was genuinely limited and who respected everyone enough to be honest about it. Clara stayed near him, and not. They moved through the evening in the orbiting way of 2 people who are comfortable not being attached at every moment, but who remain, underneath it all, in continuous awareness of where the other is. She talked to people she'd admired from a distance, a sculptor whose work she'd followed for years, a writer whose essays about urban space had influenced her thinking before she could have told you exactly how, a city official who ran the parks department and who, on learning what she'd done at Fort Greene, took her card and said, "Call me Monday. I have something I want to discuss." She did not think about Nathaniel Vaughn. She was not performing not thinking about him. He was simply not present in the room she was actually in, which was a room full of people who were interested in what she'd made. She had no way of knowing that across the city, in the process of the evening that had its own complicated shape, Nathaniel had made certain decisions that would bring him here. She had no way of knowing, yet, that he was in this room. She was talking with the sculptor about the relationship between botanical form and sculptural intention when the quality of the room changed in a way she felt rather than saw. A subtle shift in the crowd's attention, a redirection of the ambient energy toward the entrance. She turned to look. Nathaniel was standing at the edge of the entrance hall in a well-fitted suit with Sienna beside him. He was scanning the room with the particular look of a man who has arrived expecting to belong and is recalibrating. His eyes moved across the crowd with the practiced smoothness of someone who had spent years working rooms and knew how to look like he wasn't looking for anything specific. Then his eyes found her. She watched his expression change. It was not a dramatic change. It was small and quick and almost immediately controlled, the way you control something that catches you off guard when you're in a public place and can't afford to show it. But she'd spent 4 years learning to read his face, and she read it. The surprise, and underneath the surprise, something she couldn't quite name, but that had the shape of recognition. The specific recognition of something you told yourself you'd moved past until it was standing directly in front of you in a midnight blue gown that fit her exactly right, 8 feet away from a man who was looking at her the way people look at the thing they'd choose first. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Not defiantly, not warmly. Just steadily, the way you hold the gaze of someone who has been part of your life and isn't anymore. Acknowledging the fact of them without assigning it a meaning it no longer had. Then she turned back to the sculptor and picked up the conversation exactly where she'd left it. The sculptor's name was Petra Voss, and she had the quality Clara most respected in people who made things. She talked about her work with precision rather than mysticism, describing the decisions she'd made and the problems she'd solved without wrapping any of it in the language of inspiration or destiny. They were deep into a conversation about the structural tension between organic form and deliberate construction when Clara became aware that Nathaniel had moved to the edge of her peripheral vision and had not moved away from it. She didn't turn. She kept her attention on Petra, who was describing a large outdoor commission she'd completed the previous year, a series of weathered steel forms in a public plaza in Seattle that were designed to change color as they aged, the surface chemistry doing something over years that the design only initiated. It was exactly the kind of long-game thinking Clara respected, the commitment to a process you couldn't fully control, the trust in what time would make of what you'd started. The client was nervous about the aging, Petra said. They wanted to know what it would look like in 5 years. What did you tell them? I told them it would look better than it does now, which is true, but it requires a kind of faith in process that not everyone has. She tilted her head. You must deal with that too. Landscape takes longer than most clients understand. Constantly, Claire said. The Fort Greene project has trees that won't reach their intended scale for another 8 years. The client got it. A lot of clients don't. How do you get them there? I make them understand that what they're commissioning isn't a finished object. It's a beginning. She paused. Once they understand that, the timeline stops feeling like a problem. It starts feeling like the point. Petra looked at her with the specific appraisal of someone deciding whether a person is worth continued attention. Who did your training? Clara told her. Petra knew 2 of the names and asked specific questions about both. They talked for another 10 minutes until Petra was claimed by someone else, exchanged cards, and promised a conversation that Clara suspected would actually happen. She turned slightly and scanned the room with a naturalness that required more control than it looked like. Nathaniel was at the far end of the space, near the bar, with Sienna and 2 other people she didn't recognize. He was holding a drink and doing the thing she knew so well. The engaged, interested expression, the slight tilt forward, the posture of a man who was entirely present in the conversation he was in, except that she knew, because she had learned over 4 years to read the real signal underneath the performed one, that he was tracking the room. His eyes moved at intervals she could predict. Every 90 seconds, a quick scan, and then back. He was looking for her. She located Adrian on the other side of the room, in conversation with a man she recognized as the head of a large urban planning organization, and felt the quiet grounding of knowing where he was. Not needing him to come over, not performing independence by staying away, just the ordinary awareness of someone whose presence in a room was part of how the room felt. She picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and walked toward the center of the installation, which, inside the venue, took the form of a garden corridor. The grasses running along both sides of the main pathway into the dining area, lit from below in the warm amber Sol had calibrated. Several guests had stopped to photograph it. An older man in a dark suit was standing at the edge with his hands behind his back, studying it with the focused attention of someone who was actually looking rather than documenting. She stopped beside him because she recognized the focused attention and had learned to trust it as a signal of someone worth talking to. "Do you know who designed this?" he asked, without looking at her. "I did," she said. He turned. He was perhaps 65, silver-haired, with the slightly weathered look of someone who spent time outdoors. He studied her for a second. "Hartwell Studio?" "Partner," she said. "Clara Bennett." "I know the Fort Greene project," he said. "I drove past the site 3 weeks ago. I stopped and walked around the outside for 20 minutes. He paused. "I'm on the city's Public Space Commission. My name is Joseph Aldrin." She knew the name. The commission was one of the bodies that reviewed and approved major public space projects in the city. Not the Parks Department, which she'd already connected with that evening, but the broader oversight body that sat above it. She had wanted to get in front of them for 2 years. "I'd very much like to talk with you," she said. "I was going to say the same thing," he said. They talked for 20 minutes, standing in the corridor of grasses, and by the end of the conversation she had a meeting scheduled for the following month and the name of 2 other commission members she should contact. She registered all of this with the same focused attention she brought to everything, filing it carefully, aware that the evening was doing things she hadn't anticipated. That was the thing about work that was genuinely good. It moved through rooms in ways you couldn't engineer, finding its own people, making its own arguments. She'd known this intellectually for years. She was experiencing it now in the concrete and slightly dizzying form of what happened when the work you'd made was in the same room as people who could change the scale of what you were able to do. Nathaniel had gotten into the gala through a contact he'd been cultivating for 2 years, a board member of the foundation, a man named Charles Whitfield, whose goodwill Nathaniel had maintained through the deliberate social economy of someone who understood that proximity to the right people was a form of capital. He'd told Charles it would be a valuable evening for him professionally. He'd believed that when he said it. What he had not told Charles, and had barely admitted to himself, was that he'd also known Clara would be here. The press coverage of the installation had been specific enough to make that clear, and that this knowledge had been, underneath the professional rationale, a reason. He wasn't clear on what he'd expected. He'd played out versions of the evening in his head over the previous week, but the versions had all been vague on the thing that mattered, which was what happened when he actually saw her. He told himself he was coming to understand something, to close a loop, to have the experience of being in the same room and finding it manageable. He told himself a lot of things. None of them had prepared him for the moment he walked through the entrance corridor and she was 12 feet away, talking to a sculptor whose work had been featured in 2 major museum collections, in a midnight blue gown that fit her the way she'd always known how to dress when it mattered, completely without effort, which was the illusion that required the most work. Visibly pregnant with the child that was not his, in a body that was not diminished by that fact but somehow, infuriatingly, confirmed by it, as though this version of her was exactly the version that had always been coming, and he had simply failed to wait for it. He'd controlled his expression. He was good at that. What he was less good at controlling was the running inventory he'd been conducting since they walked in. The way her name kept appearing in fragments of conversation he caught moving through the room, the way people were talking about the installation with the specific enthusiasm reserved for work that solves a problem you didn't know you had, the way she moved through the space like someone who was entirely at home in it, which she was because she'd built it. He had built nothing tonight. He was here as someone's guest, at an event his company had not contributed to, in a room full of people whose respect he'd arrived hoping to absorb through proximity. Sienna was doing her work, finding the angles, greeting the people she recognized from other events, being the version of herself that photographed well and conversed brightly and generated the ambient social energy she was genuinely good at generating. He watched her do it from a slight distance and felt, for the 100th time in the past month, the specific exhaustion of someone who had made a decision they couldn't unmake and had to keep making anyway. They had not broken up. He wasn't sure why, except that he suspected it was the same mechanism that had kept him in his marriage longer than was honest. The reluctance to cause the break, to be the one who said it out loud, to absorb the weight of having gotten here and still not made it work. Charles appeared at his elbow with the timing of a man who prided himself on working his events thoroughly. "What do you think?" "It's impressive," Nathaniel said, meaning the installation, meaning the room, meaning all of it in a way he couldn't be more specific about. "The garden thing is remarkable," Charles said. "The designer, Clara Bennett, have you heard of her? She's apparently just been made partner at Hartwell's studio, and the city people are very interested in her. Aldrin was talking to her for 20 minutes. He scanned the room. "She's there, actually, in the blue." Nathaniel followed the direction of Charles's subtle gesture. Clara was talking to Joseph Aldrin, whose name Nathaniel knew because you knew that name if you cared about how things got built in this city. She was talking with her hands, the way she always did when she was explaining something she was genuinely engaged with. The small, precise gestures that mapped the shape of an idea in the air. Aldrin was listening with the full-body attentiveness of someone who had decided early in a conversation that he was going to pay close attention. "Do you know her?" Charles asked, reading something in Nathaniel's expression that made the question reasonable. "We've met," Nathaniel said. Charles waited for more. Nathaniel didn't offer it. The dinner was seated, and Clara was at a table near the front, not because it had been arranged that way to make a point, but because Adrian's foundation had placed its key guests and collaborators in that section, and she was, at this point, one of the more visible names associated with the event. She was seated between Petra, who she'd talked to earlier, and a woman named Sylvia Chen, who ran the foundation's programming division, and whom Clara had been emailing for 3 months about the installation details. Sylvia turned out to be, in person, exactly what her emails had suggested: direct, extremely knowledgeable, and possessed of a dry humor that took Clara 3 minutes to calibrate to, and then found she preferred to almost every other kind. They talked about the Foundation's upcoming projects, about the intersection of landscape and architecture in urban spaces, about a green infrastructure initiative the Foundation was developing that Sylvia described as being in the stage where they needed more people who understood both the design and the political sides of the thing. "That's a specific combination," Clara said. "Extremely specific," Sylvia agreed, "which is why we have a shortage." She looked at Clara with a directness that was not subtle. "You've worked on both sides." "The Fort Greene project involved 3 different city departments," Clara said. "The permitting process alone took 8 months. How did you navigate it?" "Badly at first. Then I hired someone who'd done it before and watched what she did." Clara paused. "Darnell, who ran the installation. He'd been doing it for 20 years. I stopped trying to do it myself and started asking him to do it, and then learning from watching him do it. It went a lot faster after that. Sylvia smiled. That's a more honest answer than I usually get. I've gotten bored of the less honest answers, Clara said. Adrian was 3 seats down, near the end of the table, in conversation with the urban planning official she'd seen him talking to earlier. He caught her eye briefly, not checking in, just the ordinary acknowledgement of 2 people who were doing their own things in the same room and were entirely fine with that. She found it steadying in a way she no longer felt the need to analyze. She looked at her food and realized with mild surprise that she was hungry, and that she was enjoying herself, and that the evening was going the way it went when things you'd worked for a long time to build finally occupied the space they were meant to. Nathaniel was at a table in the middle section of the room, seated between a woman who worked in finance and spoke exclusively about her fund, and a man who was pleasant and forgettable in the way of people who attend events like this as plus ones and have made peace with it. Sienna was 2 seats down, talking animatedly with a fashion editor she'd recognized, her energy visibly improving now that she'd found someone on her frequency. He ate his food and watched the front of the room without letting himself appear to watch the front of the room. He watched Clara lean toward Sylvia Chen and say something that made Sylvia laugh. He watched Petra Voss, whose work was in the MoMA collection, refill Clara's water glass as a casual gesture, the way you did for someone you'd decided was a peer. He watched the easy rhythm of the table, the way it had the quality of a group of people who were genuinely glad to be in each other's company rather than performing gladness, and felt the distance between that table and his own with a clarity that was almost physical. He thought about the magazine interview. He thought about the upgrade I needed, which he'd said in a conference room in a building in Midtown with a coffee in front of him and Sienna's hand in his, feeling certain and free and like a man who had made a hard decision bravely. He thought about how the sentence had landed in the world, his colleagues congratulating him on his candor, his mother calling him with that pause before she said anything, Claire's colleagues calling her in a cascade of horrified phone calls over the course of a single afternoon. He thought, I did that to her. Not abstractly, not in the softer language of it was complicated, or we both played a part, but directly. He had taken something private and real, the story of their marriage, the intimacy of what they'd built, and reduced it to a performance of his own liberation in a magazine for an audience. He had called her insufficient by name without naming her, which was, he understood now, the specific cowardice of someone who wanted the credit for a hard choice without being accountable for its cost. He had not thought about that clearly at the time. He had not wanted to. He was thinking about it clearly now. The finance woman asked him something about his startup. He answered. He ate his food. He looked at the table by the front of the room where Clara was talking to people whose respect she'd earned, wearing a dress the color of the late sky before dark, and understood, with the quiet and devastating finality of someone who had waited too long to understand something, that he had not made a brave choice. He had made a frightened one. He had left a woman who was becoming more than he'd expected, because that becoming had felt like a judgment on what he was, and he had dressed the fear up as liberation and sold it to himself and to everyone who would listen. The becoming had happened anyway, without him. He hadn't stopped it by leaving. He just removed himself from it. But the speeches began after the main course, with Charles introducing the Foundation's work in the way of someone who had given this speech many times and had found the version that worked. Adrian stood to acknowledge the audience, brief and specific, describing the projects the Foundation had funded over the past year, with the same plainness he used for everything. No inflation, no performance, just the concrete facts of what had been built and who had benefited and where the work was going next. The room listened with the quality of attention you earned rather than commanded. Then Adrian said, I want to take a minute to recognize someone who I'm not sure the Foundation could have put on this event without. Clara was looking at her water glass. She looked up. Clara Bennett, Adrian said, is the landscape architect who designed the installation you walked through tonight. It's the most beautiful piece of work I've seen in this space in the 15 years this Foundation has been holding events here. He paused. But I didn't ask her to say anything about the work tonight because you've already seen the work, and the work makes its own argument. What I want to say about Clara is something different. The room had gone quiet in the specific way of an audience that has understood this is not the part of the speech that's on the prepared notes. "A year and a half ago," Adrian said, "I met a woman at a gallery opening who talked about photography and infrastructure for 45 minutes in a way that I couldn't stop thinking about for 3 days. She was in a difficult chapter of her life, the kind that you go into not knowing if you're going to come out the other side recognizably yourself." He looked at her, directly, without the slight social hedge of someone making a speech about a person who is in the room. She came out the other side. And she came out the other side more herself than she'd been going in, which is the thing that almost never happens, and which is, when it does, the most extraordinary quality a person can have. Clara felt something move through her chest. She kept her face steady, which cost something. She built a career, raised a son, designed the finest public garden currently under construction in this city, and made the room you walked into tonight, all in the same 18 months. He paused. I don't say this to embarrass her. I say it because the people in this room have resources and influence and the capacity to commission work that matters, and she is someone whose work matters. And also because, another pause, shorter, more private, because I wanted her to know that I see it. All of it. The room applauded. Not the polite scatter of a seated audience acknowledging a speech, but the full-body response of a room that had been genuinely moved and was showing it. Clara pressed the back of one finger against the corner of her eye, an old habit for keeping the thing from spilling over. Sylvia put a hand briefly on her arm. Petra was applauding with the focus of someone who had decided this moment deserved her full attention. Clara looked at Adrian, who was looking at her, and found she had no words for what his face did to her in that moment. Not because the feeling was too large, but because it was too specific, too precise, exactly the shape of being seen by the right person for exactly the right reasons. She mouthed, "Stop." He smiled, which was rare enough to be significant. Seb. Nathaniel did not applaud with the room, because his hands were on the table and he was looking at them, and what was moving through him was something he was not going to perform in a public space no matter what it cost him to contain it. He had heard every word. He had watched the room respond. He had watched the woman at the table by the front, who had been his wife, who had loved him, whom he had publicly called insufficient, fight back tears while a room full of people who mattered stood for her. He thought about October, 14 months ago, the divorce papers under the door, the grocery store photograph he'd put on a live stream and laughed away. He thought about the month after the leaving, when he'd been so sure of himself that certainty had felt like a form of virtue. He thought about the interview and the ease with which he'd found the words, and the way ease had felt like truth. He thought about the bowl she'd left on his nightstand, the shade of blue he'd mentioned once, casually, not expecting to be remembered. She'd been paying attention to who he was before he knew enough about himself to pay that kind of attention back. He had received that attention as a given, as the ambient texture of a life that was organized around his comfort, and he had never once, not in 4 years, done the thing for her that she had done for him without thinking, paid attention to who she actually was, and loved what he found. Sienna touched his arm. "Are you okay?" He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was more perceptive than he usually credited her with. She was not, he had to admit to himself, a stupid person. She had seen things in him he hadn't wanted seen. She'd just been too young and too caught up in her own wants to know what to do with what she saw. "I need a minute," he said. "I'm fine." She withdrew her hand slowly. She looked at him for another second, and then turned back to the fashion editor, and he understood in that gesture, the measured withdrawal, the not pushing, that she was also building towards something she hadn't said yet, and that when she said it, it would be fair. He sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by the sound of applause that had faded into the ambient hum of a dinner, resuming and let himself be, for exactly as long as he needed to, simply honest with himself. He had made a mistake. Not the complexity packaged, contextually softened, mutually accountable kind of mistake that you describe to friends over drinks. A mistake. He had had something and had not seen it for what it was, and had left it, and had spent the year since then discovering what it was by watching what it became without him. There was nothing to be done about that. He understood this with a clarity that was, strangely, not entirely painful. More the sensation of a splinter finally found and removed. The brief, clean sting of truth in contact with the place it had been missing. There was no move he could make tonight or any other night that would address the fact of what he'd chosen. Clara had not rebuilt herself in response to his loss. She'd rebuilt herself because that was what she was going to do regardless. And he simply wasn't in the story anymore. He was here because he'd wanted to close a loop, and the loop was closed. It just wasn't closed the way he'd imagined it would be. After the speeches, the room loosened into the post-dinner hour, the ambient noise rising, people moving between tables, the particular energy of a formal evening exhaling into something more human. Clara excused herself from Sylvia and Petra and moved through the room, working the way she'd always worked events. Specific, purposeful, never lingering longer than the conversation warranted, always knowing where she was going next. The city parks official handed her a card and said, "Monday. Seriously." The commission member Aldrin had mentioned found her near the bar and introduced himself. She talked to 3 more people whose names she'd wanted to know and filed all of it in the competent, slightly exhausted mental filing system she was running on fumes of by 10 o'clock. She was in the entrance corridor near the grasses, taking a moment of actual quiet when she heard footsteps behind her and knew before she turned. "Clara." She turned. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the corridor a few feet away, hands in his pockets, without Sienna. He looked. She assessed him in the same way she would have assessed anything she needed to evaluate honestly. Tired. Not the tired of someone who'd had a long week, but the deeper kind. The kind that had been accumulating. "Nathaniel," she said. Steady, the way she'd been steady on the phone in March, the way she'd been steady turning back to Petra Voss when their eyes had met across the room. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "The installation has been in the press for 2 months," she said, which was not accusatory, just accurate. He absorbed that. "I knew you'd be here," he said, which she had already known. She waited. "I just wanted to—" He stopped, started again with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this and found, in the moment, that the rehearsal was useless. You look like yourself, more than I remember." She thought about what to say to that. She thought about several things. What she settled on was, "I am more myself." "I know," he said. The 2 words were quiet and had no performance in them, which was unusual for him. "I know that." She looked at him for a moment, not with warmth, not with coldness, with the clear, uncomplicated vision of someone who had traveled a very long distance and had reached a place where the view was different. "Are you well?" she asked, because it was what you asked. "I'm getting there," he said. She nodded. "Good. Clara." His voice had something in it she recognized. The register he used when he was going to say something real, the slight drop in pace that preceded honesty. "I said things. The interview. Things I said publicly that were—" He paused. "I was wrong. About what I said and about why I said it. I was—" He stopped again, and she could see him choosing between the full version and the manageable version, the way people always did when they were trying to apologize without fully arriving at the center of the thing. "I was cowardly, and I was wrong, and I know it doesn't fix anything." She let the silence hold for a moment. The grasses moved in the air around them, slow and differentiated, the pattern she'd designed for exactly this quality of moment without knowing she was designing for it. "It doesn't fix anything," she agreed. Not cruelly, just truthfully. "But I hear you." Something in his expression shifted. Not relieved. Relief would have been an insult, as though this were the resolution of something, as though her hearing him were the conclusion the whole story had been moving toward. It wasn't relief. It was something smaller and more honest. Acknowledgement. The recognition of a person who had said the thing and had it received without either absolution or hostility, and knew that was exactly what they'd earned. "How's Oliver?" he asked. "He's extraordinary," she said, and the simplicity of that, the sheer easy truth of it, seemed to cost him something. "Good," he said. "That's good." She looked at him one more time. This man she had loved and built a life with and mourned and rebuilt herself without, and felt cleanly and without drama that she was finished. Not done with the grief of it, which would come and go as these things did, but finished with the weight of it, with the carrying, with the backward-facing part. "Take care of yourself, Nathaniel," she said, She walked back toward the light. The last hour of the evening moved the way the last hour of good evenings moved. The people who needed to leave had left, and the people who remained were the ones who were genuinely glad to be there, and the room had contracted into a warmer, less formal version of itself. Clara found Adrian near the far end of the space, in conversation with Margot of all people. They'd found each other over something to do with a planning application for a project in Lower Manhattan, it turned out, which was not a coincidence she would have predicted, but which made a certain sense given the particular Venn diagram of their professional lives. "Clara," Margot said when she arrived, "did you talk to Aldrin? I have a meeting next month." "Parks?" "Monday." Margot looked at her with the expression of someone who has been proved right about a bet they'd made on another person and is deriving appropriate satisfaction from it. "Good," she said. "That's good." She looked between Clara and Adrian in the way of someone who had known Clara for 5 years and was noting, with approval, the specific quality of the thing she was observing. "I'm going to find my partner before she falls asleep standing up. Good night." She was gone in a characteristic way. Purposeful, no lingering. Clara stood with Adrian in the corner of the room, the sound of the evening around them, the light at its low, late evening angle catching the edge of the grasses in the corridor beyond. "How are you?" he asked. She considered it. "I talked to Nathaniel." He didn't say anything immediately, which was one of the things she trusted about him. "He apologized," she said. "More or less. It was imperfect, but it was real, I think." "How did it land?" "Like an ending," she said. "Not dramatic, just finished." She paused. "I'm glad it happened, and I don't need to think about it again." He nodded. He reached out and touched her hand briefly, without making a thing of it. "And the evening? Apart from that?" She looked around the room, the grasses in the corridor, moving, the faces of people she'd talked to and would talk to again, the park's official's card in her clutch, Aldrin's name in her phone. Sylvia Chen, who'd said, very specifically, "I'd like to continue this conversation in a way that had a project's shape to it." "The evening," she said, "was everything I built it to be." "It was more than that," he said. "You know that. I'm trying not to be insufferable about it." "You're allowed to be insufferable about it. One evening. I'll give you one evening of insufferable." She laughed, a real one, the kind that came without warning. He was watching her with the expression she'd learned, in months of paying attention to his face, to read as the clearest version of what he felt. Not performed, not managed, just present. "I told you it was going to be extraordinary," he said. "You say that about a lot of things." "Because a lot of things are." He looked at her steadily. "You built this. Tonight. The installation, the room, the connections you made. That was all you." "And Darnell," she said, "and Saul, and Margot, and my mother, who is at home putting our son to sleep. And all of them," he said. "Yes, but also you. You're allowed to own it." She thought about what it had taken to be here. The October morning on the kitchen floor with the divorce papers, the 19 hours of labor, the 47 items on the whiteboard, the walk to the studio every morning when she hadn't wanted to go, the drawings she'd redone 4 times to get right, the long game things, the trees that wouldn't be themselves for years, the grasses she'd chosen because they moved in ways you couldn't control. She had built all of it without knowing this exact moment was coming. She'd built it because it was the work, and the work was hers, and that was reason enough. She looked at Adrian. "Thank you for what you said in the speech. I meant every word." "I know you did. That's why I'm thanking you." She held his gaze. "You see me, not a version of me. Not the version you thought I'd be, or the version I perform. The actual me, which is," she paused, "not always the easiest thing to see." "It is for me," he said simply. "It always has been." She took his hand. Outside, the March night was cold and clear. Inside, the room continued around them. The sound of it, the warmth, the grasses moving, the slow, good end of an evening that had been, in ways she couldn't have planned for, the truest accounting of a 1.5 years' worth of building. She was not finished building. She knew that. There were more mornings of early Oliver, more drawings that needed 4 attempts, more winters before the trees at Fort Greene were themselves. There were more imperfect days ahead and more things to figure out, and more times when she'd run at 110% and need someone to put a blanket over her on the couch. But she was here. She was exactly here, in this room, holding the hand of a man who had learned to read her face at an event shaped by her own work. At the end of a year, she had survived and made something of. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. They drove back to Brooklyn after midnight, the city quiet in the particular way it got in the early hours of a Saturday when the week had finally exhausted itself. Clara had her heels off before they reached the bridge, her feet pulled up on the seat, the lights of the city coming through the window in long orange streaks across her dress. Adrian was driving, which he'd insisted on, and she'd let him without the usual negotiation because she was tired in a way that had moved past the point of arguing about small things. "Aldrin," she said, not quite a full sentence. "I know," he said, "and Parks, and Sylvia Chen, who I think is about to offer me something I'm going to have to think hard about whether to take." "What kind of something?" She wasn't specific, but she used the phrase ongoing relationship with the Foundation, and she had a particular look when she said it. Clara turned her head against the headrest to look at him. The kind of look that means there's a number attached and the number is serious. What would you want it to involve? She thought about it. She'd been thinking about it since the moment Sylvia said it, the way she always did. The immediate projection forward, the assessment of what it would cost and what it would require and what it would change. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the most honest answer. "I need to hear what it actually is before I decide anything." "That's sensible." "I'm practicing not deciding things before I know what I'm deciding." She paused. "It's harder than it sounds." "For you it is." She looked at him. Was that a criticism? It was an observation. You plan forward compulsively. It's part of why your work is as good as it is. He glanced at her briefly. It's also something you do when you're scared. She considered arguing with that. She didn't because it was accurate. "I'm not scared tonight." "I know," he said. "Tonight you were just planning because you were excited." He paused. I could tell the difference. She looked back out the window at the bridge, the water beneath it black and wide. "You've been paying attention." "Since the beginning," he said. She let that sit without qualifying it or redirecting it or doing any of the things she sometimes did when something was true and also tender. She just let it be. Her mother was asleep on the couch when they got in, a habit she'd developed that no amount of persuasion toward the guest bed had been able to break. She startled awake when the door opened, took in Clara's face in the low light, and said, "Good?" "Very good," Clara said. Her mother looked at Adrian. He nodded once. She seemed to find this a sufficient account of the evening and resettled herself on the couch with the pillow she'd claimed as her own over the months she'd been staying. "Oliver was up at 10, she said, eyes already closing. "Wanted you. I convinced him the situation was temporary." "Thank you, Mom." "Stop thanking me and go to bed." Clara stood in Oliver's doorway for a moment. He was on his back with one arm thrown out to the side, the way he always slept, entirely committed to unconsciousness, the whole of him devoted to the project of sleep with the same intensity he brought to everything. She watched his chest rise and fall. She had done this every night since April, stood in this doorway and watched him breathe, and it had never once stopped being extraordinary to her. Not in a way she could explain to someone who hadn't done it, just the plain ongoing fact of a person she had made, asleep in a room she had made ready for him, alive and safe and entirely himself. She thought about what she'd said to Petra Voss about the Fort Greene trees. Once they understand that what they're commissioning isn't a finished object, it's a beginning. She had been talking about landscape design. She had also been talking about this. She closed the door softly and went to bed. The Monday meeting with the parks official, whose name was Leonard Park, and who had the manner of a man who had been making large institutional decisions for 20 years and had developed a tolerance for neither flattery nor delay, lasted 45 minutes and resulted in two things: an invitation to submit a proposal for a redesign of a community park in a neighborhood of Brooklyn that had been waiting for funding for 9 years, and an introduction to the 3-person team that would assess the proposal. The park was not large. The project was not the most prestigious thing Clara had been offered. It was a park in a neighborhood where the majority of people who would use it were kids and older residents, and people who didn't have the option of going somewhere nicer, and it had been underfunded and underloved for nearly a decade. She said yes before Leonard finished describing it. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Most people ask about the budget first. What's the budget? She asked. He told her. She ran the numbers briefly in her head. We can do it, she said. It'll require some creative thinking on the plant sourcing, but we can do it. Leonard looked at her for a moment with the particular look of a bureaucrat who had been in his job long enough to recognize the difference between someone who said yes because the opportunity was professionally useful and someone who said yes because they actually wanted the thing. Aldrin said you were direct, he said. He was right. He's the one who had the good conversation, she said. I just showed up. You showed up with that installation, Leonard said, and there was something in his voice that was not flattery but straightforward assessment. That's not nothing. She drove back to the studio with the meeting notes in her bag and texted Darnell, I have a park in Brooklyn. Are you in? His reply came back in 4 minutes. What neighborhood? She told him. A pause. Then, those people have needed a decent park for years. Yes, I'm in. She pulled up the whiteboard app on her tablet and started a new section. The items accumulated quickly, because they always did, and because she'd learned by now that the accumulation wasn't a problem to be managed but a form of momentum, evidence of something that was actually moving. Met. The Denver conference was in April, 11 days after Oliver's first birthday. Clara flew out on a Thursday, her mother and a revised bedtime routine standing in for her. Oliver apparently handling the separation with the philosophical equanimity he'd been developing lately toward events he found inconvenient but couldn't prevent. She'd called him from the hotel room the first night on video, and he'd stared at the phone with an expression of polite suspicion and then lost interest and attempted to eat the phone, which she chose to interpret as a sign he was fine. The conference was 3 days, and she was speaking on the second afternoon in a panel about the role of native plantings in urban sustainability infrastructure, a topic she'd prepared for rigorously and then had to substantially revise 3 days before when she realized the prepared version was the version she'd give if she were trying to sound like she knew what she was doing instead of the version she'd give if she were just telling the truth. The revised version started with Fort Greene, with the site visit when Darnell had told her the west border was wrong, with the specific embarrassment of having missed something a more experienced eye had caught, with what she'd had to learn in real time, on a real project, with real consequences, that her education and her talent hadn't prepared her for. She talked about the long game problem, the difficulty of designing for outcomes you couldn't live to see, the specific discipline of committing to a future that extended well past your own involvement, the degree to which the best landscape work was fundamentally an act of trust in people you'd never meet. She was not sure, delivering it, whether it was too honest for a professional conference. She'd spent the years before her marriage and during it carefully calibrating what she showed in professional contexts, managing the presentation, keeping the visible surface smooth. She'd gotten less interested in that over the past year. Not because professionalism didn't matter. It did, and she was more exacting about her actual work than she'd ever been, but because the performance of effortlessness had started to feel like a tax she'd decided to stop paying. The room was quiet for the full 20 minutes. The moderator opened the floor, and the first question was from a landscape architect from Portland who said, "The thing you described about learning from your installer. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never heard anyone say that out loud in this context." She paused. "Why do you think that is?" "Because we're afraid it makes us look like we don't know what we're doing," Clara said. "And the people who are most afraid of that are usually the ones who actually do know what they're doing. The ones who don't know are too confident to be afraid." There was a laugh from the room, the kind that had recognition in it. She answered questions for 25 minutes after the panel ended, standing at the front while the session chairs discreetly cleared for the next panel. She gave out every card she had. 3 people asked about the Fort Greene project specifically, and one of them, a woman who directed the Parks Department of a mid-sized city in Ohio, said, "I've been trying to make the case for exactly this kind of design philosophy for 3 years. Could I contact you?" "Please," Clara said. She flew home on Saturday and went directly from the airport to her mother's couch, where Oliver was performing his current favorite activity, which was pulling himself to standing against the coffee table and then looking around to see who had noticed. He noticed her the moment she walked through the door. His face did the thing it did, the total and undivided illumination of a person for whom the arrival of the right person was still the most significant event in any given moment. She crossed the room and picked him up and held him against her, and he grabbed her hair in both fists with the firmness of someone making a territorial claim. "Hi, baby," she said into the top of his head. He made a sound of pronounced satisfaction, which she took as forgiveness for 3 days. What? The proposal for the Brooklyn Park was submitted in May and approved in June, which was faster than any municipal approval had any right to be, and which Leonard told her, when he called with the news, was a direct result of the commission having already seen the Fort Greene site and the gala installation. "You have credibility now," he said, which was not a warm statement, but was, from Leonard, high praise. The park would break ground in September. She would have Darnell and Sol for the lighting elements she was already designing, and a new junior architect she'd hired in the spring named Thomas, who was 24 and had a genuine eye and the particular qualities she'd come to value above almost everything else in the people she worked with. He knew the difference between what he understood and what he didn't, and was not too proud to say so. Thomas reminded her of herself at 24, before she'd learned to be afraid of being wrong. She was trying, with him, to short-circuit the period of learning that lesson, to skip directly to the part where you understood that being wrong quickly was more useful than being cautious slowly. He was receptive to it. He also had opinions about things she hadn't asked him to have opinions about, which was irritating in proportion to how frequently he was right. "This section," he said one afternoon in July, pointing at a corner of the park's play area design, "feels like you're hedging." She looked at where he was pointing. She looked at it for a long moment. "Why?" "Because the rest of the design takes a position," he said carefully, which was the voice of someone who had figured out how to say a true thing to a partner without getting fired for it. "This section looks like you gave the committee a choice instead of making a decision." She stared at the design. She thought about the meeting in which she'd made that call, the moment she'd sensed the committee's hesitation and had backed off the bolder option. She thought about the word Nathaniel had used in a different context, in a different life, that she'd unpacked slowly over a year and a half. Cowardly. She'd used it about him. She hadn't thought about using it about herself. "You're right," she said. Thomas looked like he'd expected to have to argue further and was slightly off balance by her concurrence. "Okay," he said. "Redraw it," she said. "The original version. Let's take another look at it." He redrew it. She took another look at it. She submitted the revision to Leonard with a note that said she'd reconsidered one section and explained why, and Leonard replied, "We'll discuss at the next check-in." At the next check-in, the committee approved it without significant objection. She told Thomas the next morning. He nodded with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to look too pleased. "Learn this one early," she told him. "The hedged version is never actually safer. It just looks safer on the day you submit it." He wrote it down. She pretended not to notice. Sylvia Chen's offer arrived formally in July, 3 months after the gala, in an email that was 14 lines long and entirely specific. The Laurent Foundation wanted to establish a residency program for emerging landscape architects focused on urban sustainability, and they wanted Clara to design the curriculum and direct its first 3-year cohort. It was a 2-day-a-week commitment, structured to run alongside her work at Hartwell's studio. The number attached was, as she'd suspected, serious. She read the email 3 times at her desk. Then she went to Margot's office. Margot read it twice. She put it down. She looked at Clara with the expression of someone who was calculating several things simultaneously and had arrived at a conclusion. "You want to do it," she said. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "You came in here with a specific look," Margot said. "The same look you had when you told me about the community park proposal. That's your, yes, but I need to think about it look." "I didn't know I had a look." "You have many looks. I've cataloged most of them." Margot sat back. "My question is whether you can manage the load. Not emotionally. I know you can manage it emotionally. You managed the last 18 months. You can manage anything. I mean practically. 2 days a week for the residency, the park project, your existing client load, and Oliver." "Oliver's walking now," Clara said, which was not directly relevant, but felt like it was. Margot looked at her. "Does he being able to walk change your scheduling constraints?" "No," Clara admitted. He's walking. I wanted to say it out loud. Something in Margot's expression shifted, the professional calculation retreating briefly to make room for something more human. When did that happen? Last week. He just stood up from the table one afternoon and walked to the couch like he'd been doing it for years. No fanfare. Like his mother, Margot said. Clara looked at her. The partnership, Margot said. The Denver conference. The gala. You just do things without making a production of arriving, she paused. I mean that as an observation and a compliment. Clara thought about this on the way back to her office. She thought about what it meant to just do things. The question of whether that was a quality she'd always had or one she'd developed in the past year and a half, and whether it mattered which. She suspected it was both. The original material had always been there, but the past year had burned off the overlay of performance and accommodation and careful management of how she appeared, and what was left was just herself, running at her actual speed, doing the work she was actually capable of. She accepted Sylvia's offer the next morning. In August, Nathaniel Vaughn and Sienna Park ended their relationship. Clara found out the way she found out things about Nathaniel now, through the impersonal medium of a news item in a social column, 2 sentences, no quote from either party. She read it once, felt a brief acknowledgement of it somewhere in the mid-range of her emotions. Not satisfaction, not grief, something more like the mild recognition of a fact that confirms a thing you already understood, and then made herself another cup of coffee and went back to the park drawings. She did not call anyone about it. She did not text Renata with the screenshot. She noticed this absence of reaction and found it, on reflection, the truest measure of how far she'd traveled. Not because Nathaniel's life was irrelevant, it had been a central fact of hers for years, but because it was no longer her story. It was just a thing that had happened to someone she used to know. She thought about him sometimes, in the way you thought about periods of your life that had been formative, even when they were also painful. She thought about what she'd understood in the corridor with the grasses, when he'd looked at her and said, I was cowardly with the bare honesty of someone who had finally arrived at a true thing they'd been avoiding. She thought about what it must have cost him to say it, and about what it meant that it had cost him that much, and about the degree to which the person who could finally say that was a more honest version of the person she'd been married to. Too late for her. Not necessarily too late for whoever came next, if he did the harder work of actually changing rather than just acknowledging. She didn't know if he would. She found she genuinely hoped he would. Not for any reason that involved her, not because his growth was a story she needed to be part of, but because she had enough distance now to wish him the ordinary human wish of becoming someone better than he'd been. That was the quietest kind of progress, she thought. When you stopped wanting someone to suffer for what they'd done to you and started just not thinking about them that much. Oliver's first word was more. This was not, as Clara's mother pointed out, subtle. He said it first in September, standing in his high chair, both hands extended toward the bowl of blueberries she'd set out of his reach, with the absolute conviction of a person who had identified what he wanted and was deploying language as a tool for the first time. He said it repeatedly for the next 3 days, about blueberries, about a stuffed animal he'd lost behind the couch, about the swing at the park, about the bath, about her. When she set him down and he didn't want to be set down. More. Just more. More of whatever this was. More of the person he was attached to. More of the things that felt good. More of the world that was continuously arriving with things he hadn't encountered yet. She thought about it later after he was asleep, sitting in her studio with a cup of tea and the park drawings open on the table in front of her. She thought about what it meant that his first word was a demand for continuation. Not a name, not a need for comfort, but the pure, appetitive statement of a person who had discovered that the world was interesting and wanted to be in it. She thought he'd gotten that from somewhere. She thought she knew where. Adrian asked her to marry him in October. Not with planning or theater, which she'd have expected from almost anyone else and which would, she suspected, have made her reflexively retreat, because the performance of grand gestures had become, in her understanding of her own reactions, something she associated with attention paid to the occasion rather than to her. He asked her on a Sunday morning in the Brooklyn kitchen, both of them in the ordinary clothes of a weekend, Oliver in the living room running a systematic test of what happened when you drop different objects off the edge of the coffee table, her mother's coffee cup still on the counter from her visit the previous day. He'd been talking about the Vermont property. His parents were thinking about whether they wanted to spend winters there. And there were practical questions about the house that his father kept not quite raising on their calls. He'd been trying to figure out how to actually address it without making it a conversation. And then, in the way of someone who had decided to say something and had been waiting for the right moment until they understood there was no right moment, only the decision to say it, he stopped talking about Vermont and said, "I want us to be a family, not a version of it, an actual one." She looked at him. "I know what that means for you," he said. "I know it's not simple. I know it's not just you. It's Oliver, and it's what you've built, and those things come first." He paused. "I'm not asking you to put anything second. I'm asking if you want what I want, which is all of this exactly as it is, but permanent." She sat with that word. Permanent. Not the romantic version of it, the candlelit version, the proposal as performance version, but the plain meaning of it. Lasting. Chosen not just in the extraordinary moments, but in the Tuesday mornings, and the 2 a.m. wakings, and the weeks when everything was too much, and the evenings that were just evenings. "It hasn't always been easy," she said. Not as a warning, as a fact, offered to someone she trusted to already know it. "No," he said, "it hasn't." "I've been a lot of work," she said, "figuring out how to let someone actually in, how to not perform independence so hard that I keep the real help at arm's length. I'm still figuring that out." "I know," he said. "You're also the most present person I've ever been with. When you're in, you're all the way in. That's not nothing." She thought about 4 years of paying attention to someone who hadn't noticed. She thought about learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, to redirect that attention toward people and things that reflected it. She thought about Oliver in the next room, dropping objects off a table with scientific inquiry. She thought about the park in Brooklyn that would start construction in a month, the residency program that was already attracting applicants whose work made her sit forward in her chair, the trees at Fort Greene that were finally beginning to look like they'd been there a while. She thought about what she'd said to Thomas about the hedged design. The hedged version is never actually safer. It just looks safer on the day you submit it. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, just slightly, the small release of someone who had been holding something. "Yeah?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily, the same way she'd looked at everything she'd meant in the past year and a half, without hedging, without the protective layer of irony or qualification. "I want what you want. I've wanted it for a while. I was just making sure I wanted it for the right reasons." "And you're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "I'm also going to be afraid sometimes, and I'm going to overwork. And some nights I'm going to fall asleep on the couch 40 minutes into a sentence." "I know all of this," he said. "And Oliver is going to drop things off coffee tables and say more about everything indefinitely." "I'm aware of Oliver's personality," he said. "I'm a fan of Oliver's personality." She reached across the table and took both his hands. He turned them over and held hers. In the living room, something small and plastic hit the floor with a definitive sound, followed by the cheerful noise of a person who had completed a satisfying experiment and was immediately beginning to formulate the next one. The Fort Greene garden was completed in its first full phase in November. The trees stood in their positions against the autumn sky, still young enough to have the slight provisional quality of things that hadn't fully committed to being permanent yet. The meadow plantings had spread over the summer in exactly the way Clara had drawn them, the grasses and the low wildflowers inhabiting the space she'd given them with the practical industriousness of things that were simply doing what they did. The gathering space at the center, the widening in the path, the place she'd stood and imagined a year ago, was being used, which was the only measure that mattered. People sat on the benches she'd specified. Children cut across the grass. An older man had, apparently, taken to doing his morning exercises there on weekdays, which Darnell had reported with the satisfaction of someone watching a thing he'd built get used in ways its designers hadn't predicted. She went to see it on a Thursday morning, alone, before the site visit she had scheduled with Thomas for later that day. She walked the whole space in the November cold, starting at the entrance where the first of her plant choices had established itself along the low border, moving through the path to the gathering space, then out to the west border. Darnell's border, she still thought of it, where his knowledge of the block's shadow patterns had given her something better than what she'd designed. She stood there for a while, in the cold and the gray light, and thought about everything that had been built in the same span of time as these trees. Not just professionally, all of it. She had been wrong about some of it. She'd overworked and underslept and made decisions she'd had to revisit, and had days when the whole enterprise of staying upright felt like more than she had reserves for. She'd cried in a few places she hadn't intended to, and been less patient than she wanted to be in more conversations than she'd like to remember. She had been, throughout, a real person in difficult circumstances, doing an imperfect job of navigating them, not a symbol or a story or a lesson about resilience. Just a woman trying to rebuild her life without letting the rebuilding become its own performance. The thing she'd understood, somewhere in the middle of all of it, not as a revelation, not suddenly, but slowly and by accumulation, was this. The people who hurt you are not the authors of what you become. They are a factor, sometimes a significant one, but the authorship is yours. You can give it to them if you choose, can let what they did to you become the organizing principle of your life, the wound around which everything arranges itself. Some people did that. She understood why. There were periods when she'd been close to it. Or you could do the harder thing, which was to take the fact of what happened, hold it clearly without softening it or dramatizing it, and then build forward from where you were. Not pretending the damage wasn't real, not performing recovery you hadn't actually reached, just getting up and doing the next thing, and the thing after that, with as much honesty and attention as you had available on any given day. She thought about Oliver's first word, more. She thought about what it meant to be a person who wanted more, not as greed, not as dissatisfaction, but as the basic orientation of a life that was still, even after everything, leaning toward what came next. She thought about what she wanted Oliver to understand eventually, when the years had given him enough context for it to mean something. Not a lesson she would deliver. She had a low opinion of delivered lessons, but something he would absorb by proximity. Something like, the things you build with your own hands are different from the things that are given to you, not because given things have less value, but because built things carry the history of their making, and that history is a form of knowledge you can't get any other way. And something like, the people who see you really see you, not the version of you they need you to be, are worth finding and worth keeping, and they are rarer than most people admit when they're busy settling for the version that's available. She would do an imperfect job of showing him this. She already was. But she would do it consistently and honestly and with her full attention, which was the only real promise she had to make. The wedding, when it happened, was small. Not because either of them was hiding anything or because the size of the event needed to be calibrated against the size of the previous one or any other symbolic logic. Simply because when Clara and Adrian sat down to talk about what they actually wanted, they both arrived independently at the same answer. The people who mattered most, a place that was genuinely theirs, and no part of the day that was there because it was expected rather than wanted. They got married in the walled garden of the Brooklyn townhouse on a Saturday in late May, when the roses were at the beginning of their bloom and the lavender in the south bed was showing its first full purple of the season. The guest list was 30 people: Renata and David, Margot, Darnell, Sylvia Chen, Petrovos, Marguerite and her family, Adrian's parents, Clara's mother, a handful of people whose friendship had proven itself over the preceding 2 years in the specific ways that friendship proves itself. By showing up, by being honest, by staying. Joseph Aldrin sent flowers and a note and had a long-standing conflict he'd genuinely tried to get out of. Leonard Park came for an hour and drank 1 glass of sparkling water and said, in lieu of a toast, "The park in Flatbush is the best thing I've approved in 9 years," which was, by his standards, an extraordinary speech. Oliver, 14 months old and in possession of strong opinions about formal clothing, wore a small suit he'd agreed to for approximately 40 minutes before issuing a definitive verdict against it and being permitted to change into the striped shirt he preferred. He spent the ceremony in Adrian's mother's arms, observing the proceedings with the air of a person who was gathering data he would evaluate later, and fell asleep during dinner against his grandmother's shoulder with the completeness of someone who had processed enough of the world for one day and was taking himself offline. Clara stood in her garden in May light, in a dress that was not the dress of a woman who was being married for the first time, and not the dress of a woman trying to signal that it was the second time either. Just a dress, pale silk, Simple enough to let the garden do what gardens did. She looked at the person she was marrying. She thought about what it had cost to get here, and what it had built in her, and how neither of those things could be separated from the other because the cost was the building. You didn't get the version of yourself who knew how to stand in a garden and choose someone clearly without having first been broken down to the foundations and having to figure out what you were made of. She knew what she was made of now. That was not nothing. She made her promises in the afternoon light, in a garden she'd planted with her own hands, while her son slept and her friends stood in the damp grass and the roses opened around them all in the slow, insistent way of things that had been growing quietly all along, waiting for the right conditions, entirely indifferent to whether anyone was paying attention. They were paying attention. She was paying attention. This was what it looked like, in the end. Not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfying arc of a story where the person who hurt you watches you win. Life was less theatrical than that, and more durable. It looked like a garden in May, and a baby in a striped shirt, and a man who had learned to read her face. It looked like a whiteboard with 47 items and a park in Flatbush where kids would play in September. It looked like work you believed in, and people who showed up, and the long, unspectacular, entirely sufficient practice of building something real. It looked like more. Always. Still, more.